Hello there, welcome to the Saroy channel and welcome to my Omnibus series. I've got so many of these omnibuses that are going to come out so that you'll be able to listen to an hour's worth of stories, which I know you're going to love. You know, the thing is that telling stories is such a fine art, and it's something that was practiced hundreds of years ago when people didn't have the technology that we have today. And everyone would gather around the fire and listen to a wonderful story. And also, what is so wonderful about a story is that personally, I think it is the best way to go to sleep. Every night when I go to bed, I always listen to stories. And that's something that parents used to do with their children. It's something that they still do with their children. There's nothing better than a good story. And so I hope you're going to enjoy this series. And before we start, I just want to say, do subscribe to my channel because you don't want to miss out on anything. Because I'm in for the long haul and I want to make sure that you get the most stunning stories to go to bed with at night or to listen to when you want to be one of those people sitting beside the fire and listening. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel and let's get started. I hope you're going to enjoy the omnibus.
Dear Sarah and all your lovely listeners, my name is Jaden and I'm from the tree-covered Appalachian mountain state called West Virginia, and it's known as the quintessential mountain state as it's the only state in the Appalachian region. Its elevation is higher than any other state east of the Mississippi River. West Virginia capital is Charleston, and our state bird is the northern cardinal, and our flower is the rhododendron. I was born and raised in the historic town of Harper's Ferry, and this is a famous site of the age-old Civil War raid where the Shenandoah River meets the Potomac River. When I was about 10 years old, my family moved from Harper's Ferry to Charleston in West Virginia, which is where I still live all these years later with my lovely wife. My two boys have long since flown the nest and have got large families of their own these days. My wife and I still live in the delightful home where we raised our children here in Charleston. We reside in a delightful green leafy neighbourhood called Styles Point, and I live here in a pretty cottage-style home with a sizable front and back yard, with a beautiful pristine turf and ubiquitous amount of trees in the backyard. My story begins in about 2015, when I was 58 years old and my obstinate and pertinacious wife, Polly, was insisting on putting me on a drastically reduced calorie-restricted diet. My wife had never packed any punches, nor is she very subtle or kind with her words, but has always been brutally honest to the point where she can almost become offensive. It's lucky I have a thick rhino-like skin, or I think my confidence would be at an all-time low. I've been called a beached whale, a walrus and a hippo before, but I know my wife means well and is trying to shock me into doing something drastic about my weight. You look like you're 9 months pregnant, she told me, and even when I was at my heaviest when I was pregnant with our children, my stomach didn't look as massive as yours does. You really need to go on a diet. You look like an inflated beach ball, she remarked. Those words were not pretty to hear, but they fell on deaf ears anyway, as I've always enjoyed my delicious food. But I realised with horror that my wife meant business. I promise you, she began busily bustling around that kitchen of ours with open bin liners, doggedly throwing out all my favourite snacks and containers of ice cream into those bags. I knew by that determined no-nonsense expression written on her very serious face that I'd be living on very meagre insipid offerings in the weeks that followed. And as I suspected, I wasn't wrong. To make matters worse, my wife is a deplorable cook, boiling the life out of everything she rustles up in that kitchen. "What on earth are you doing?" I asked, looking mortified. "Removing temptation from you," she pronounced proudly, as she continued to pile all my favourite snacks into that bin liner. "You do not have any willpower whatsoever. You're like a pot-belly pig that just cannot stop eating. I need to take drastic action on your account, or else what kind of a wife would I be?" "A very nice one," I said. "One who doesn't deprive her husband of the good things in life. We only live once." "That's the problem, dear," scolded my wife. "I want you around for a very long time, and with your ballooning waistline, I'm gravely concerned with your health. You're clinically obese," she told me. And so began my tireless, cheerless weight loss journey. Every day my plate was piled up with a scant portion of boiled insipid-looking broccoli, lean fish or chicken, all cooked within an inch of its life. It was a challenge to eat such monotonous, dreary, tiresome food day in and day out. My stomach would make such gurgling, grumbling noises because it was not used to such a calorie deficit. Before long I was dreaming of burgers and fries, sticky spare ribs and tacos filled with mince, avocado and grated cheese. I would salivate longingly as I would imagine myself indulging in this delicious, delectable food. Boy, how I missed it so very much. I'm afraid to admit it to you, but one day temptation finally slaughtered my resolve to remain disciplined. On this occasion my wife was on her way to her local pottery class. I do not believe I've been more pleased to see her leave our premises as I was then. I was actually almost whooping with delight when I heard her car driving away from our premises. I remember piping out ecstatically, "Yay! Yay! She's gone!" It was like the age-old adage, when the cat's away, the mice do play. I kid you not, with the countenance of an exuberant dog about to get a juicy, succulent fillet steak, now that the owner was away. In moments after my wife had driven off, leaving the back door wide open, I dived into my truck as fast as I possibly could, and I sneakily ambled off to Taco Bell, where I brought myself a cheesy beef burrito, some potato chips, along with a chocolate milkshake. I remember jubilantly creeping back into our house like a furtive, villainous burglar, knowing I was doing something naughty and devilishly sinful as far as my wife was concerned. But guess what? I didn't care at all. My childhood memories of my misbehaving wayward ways came flooding back, and I felt like an unruly kid all over again. It did feel rather good to cheat and get away with something, I have to admit. It gave me a feeling that I'd got one up on my wife. I hurriedly began to open my burrito package as fast as I possibly could. In fact, anyone observing me would have believed I had not seen food in decades, and had emerged from the depths of the jungle starving and desperate. But I was, in a way, I suppose, because without putting too fine a point on it, my wife's insipid, bland food had left me longing for this moment, with a burning desire that could not be quashed or suppressed. It just couldn't. I crammed that burrito into my open mouth with a ravenous enthusiasm, and I took a scrumptious bite. Oh, words fail to describe the flavoursome taste of the melt-in-the-mouth cheese, with seasoned savoury mince oozing out of that burrito, with the rich, fragrant, savoury aroma titillating my taste buds in a wild frenzy. I was in Ambrosian food heaven. "Oh, this is so good," I said to myself, tucking into the appetising burrito with great gusto. It was delicious, palatable, and yummy. All of a sudden I heard this strange voice saying, "Who's a naughty boy?" I looked around, feeling my face growing red with embarrassment, as I sensed that I'd been caught red-handed, with my fingers in the cookie jar, so to speak. I gave our living room the once-over, but no one was there. And then I heard it again. "Who's a naughty boy?" If that wasn't bad enough, the voice said, "I know what you did. I know what you did. Who's a naughty boy?" I was wondering where the voice was coming from, and I was feeling certain that someone was spying on me. And I had in some way been set up. I even wondered if my wife had some sneaky hidden device with an inbuilt camera waiting to catch me out if I cheated on my diet. I would never put anything past her, as she can be as stringent and strict as an army officer. Once again the voice repeated itself. "Who's a naughty boy? I know what you did. Put the kettle on." I don't know what made me look up towards the ceiling, but to my astonishment, perching there on the bookshelf was this large white parrot, with an underlay of mother-of-the-pearl peachy feathers, and he was beautiful. The parrot kept regarding me with his bright, dark, curious eyes, and to my amazement he flew down from the bookshelf and landed on my shoulders with a cocky sense of self-assurance, almost as if he'd known me all my life. He began to nibble my ear, and he kept saying to me, "Who's a naughty boy? I know what you did. Put the kettle on." I began to laugh and laugh, so much so that my stomach was aching. I can assure you that my rather humourless wife was not amused to find a parrot on my shoulders when she returned home from her pottery class. "Where on earth did you get that parrot from?" she said, looking at me suspiciously. "You didn't go and buy him behind my back, did you?" she asked. "I'd never put anything past you. You and the kids have always tried to squirrel animals into the house behind my back. Don't think I don't know about that." "Of course I didn't go and buy it," I said. "It must have flown into the house when I left the back door open, when I went into the yard. I found it perched on the bookshelf there." My wife's eyes darted towards the bookshelf warily. "You don't think he's been distributing his droppings up there?" she asked in alarm. "Calm down," I said. "Parrots are very clean birds." "Well, you're not keeping him," said my wife. "He must belong to someone. We'll have to find the owner as soon as we possibly can. You need to make some calls right now. Phone all the vets and rescue places and make up some leaflets." "Yes, dear," I said. I knew better than to argue with my wife. My wife Polly is exceedingly house-proud, and I could see that she was more than a little worried about the state of her immaculate furnishings and her pristine spick-and-span house. Over the years, even my sons begged her for a dog or cat, but that was never ever going to happen, because she was very ill-disposed towards having pet hares in our home. I remember she did bend the rules once and allowed my son to have a hamster because the poor little mite was safely tucked away in a cage. I do recall one day when the hamster escaped and was running around our squeaky-clean furniture, my wife began to scream blue murder. "Get that dirty thing out of here," she cried out in disgust. I promise you, she pugnaciously charged around that house of ours like a headless chicken with a broom in her hand. She battered that broom around the place as she tried to extract the hamster from under the sofa. "It's going to spoil my furnishings," she shrieked. Luckily, my son did manage to retrieve the frightened hamster and return it safely back to its cage. My wife would complain tirelessly about the noise the hamster made at night, going around and around on its wheel. "Won't that thing ever shut up?" she'd complain, throwing a pillow over her head, trying to get to sleep. Over the years, my sons privately confided in me at how much they resented their mother for not allowing them to keep animals. I empathised with their plight, as I knew all too well how they felt, for as a young boy I had grown up with animals myself. I emphatically believed that our house was not really complete without a dog or a cat, as a joyful ball of rambunctious energy with a wagging tail would have been a welcome addition to our home, I assure you. "All my friends have dogs," my son Lincoln would complain. "Can't you speak to her dad for me, please? I beg you. I want a dog so badly." "Son," I would say, "you know your mother is scrupulous about cleanliness. I honestly don't think I'll be able to talk her round." But despite my best efforts, my wife opposed to anything with fur residing in our home, and so it was a losing battle for the all of us. Fast forward a few weeks, and we had not found the owner of the parrot, and no one had come forward to claim the bird. I bought a very attractive gilded gold cage that I surreptitiously placed in the corner of our living room, and in the weeks that followed, a miracle transpired to my wife. It was like she metamorphosized into a whole new woman. I could hardly believe it. For some incongruous, unexplained reason, she began to develop a relationship with this very garrulous bird, who just loved to talk and talk and talk, and for some peculiar reason this incredible parrot had literally melted my wife's heart in a way that no other animal had ever done before. It had almost broken through that hard exterior and touched the very core of her soul, and I was so transfixed by this extraordinary turn of events. You'd have to know my wife to understand. I would literally catch my wife cleaning the living room, fully engaged in a heart-to-heart conversation with the parrot, and I could tell by her animated demeanour that she was totally smitten by the bird. "Who's a good boy?" I would hear her say. "Who's a pretty boy? Such a handsome boy." The parrot would cock its head from one side to another as if he understood every word that she was saying, and he would say, "Who's a pretty boy? Who's a pretty boy? Who's a pretty boy?" I would hear my wife squealing with laughter. When I suggested we should try and find a home for the parrot, my wife kept fobbing me off. "That won't be necessary, dear." I played my wife at her own game, and I would say, "But we need to get rid of him as soon as we possibly can. He's a very dirty bird. We don't want something like him around." "No, he's not," said my wife, coming to his immediate defence. "He's very clean, I'll have you know. And besides, I think he's very happy here." If that wasn't shocking enough for you, believe me, there were occasions she'd let him out of his cage to perch on her shoulders while she hoovered the entire house. I even sent photographs of her to my dumbfounded sons, who contacted me immediately and said, "Dad, is this some kind of a wind-up?" They couldn't believe my fastidious wife was allowing the parrot free rein over our living room, as this would never normally have happened. My wife always made me take my shoes off before I walked over our cream carpet, But guess what? That parrot could do anything he liked. I was almost jealous of the bird, the hold it had over my wife. Remind me when I visit you next, Lincoln teased, to take some pointers from that sharp parrot. He's got Mum under his thumb, or should I say talon. Polly and I decided to call the parrot Tattletale for obvious reasons, because his vocabulary consisted of, "I'll call the police. I know what you did. Who's a naughty boy? I'm going to tell." All these were sayings he'd learnt from his previous owner, whom had never come forward to claim him, much to the delight of my wife, who was exceedingly bonded to the parrot by now. I honestly think it would have torn her to pieces if the parrot was ever claimed, and if she had to choose between me and the parrot, I think I stood a better chance of being turfed out of the house than he did. You may wonder what all this has to do with the Bigfoot encounter, but I emphatically assure you, as is always the case with the assemblages of life, it would seem that everything is inexplicably linked, much like a vast spider web of silken fibres that come together to create the web. So it is with the master plan of life, as choices invariably lead to outcomes, and getting Tattletale was a catalyst that ultimately led to our Bigfoot encounter. It would seem that our beautiful parrot precipitated and enkindled in us a fervent passion for birds. Before long we were not only watching our own garden birds intently, but had joined a fanatical bird-watching group here in West Virginia, something that would never normally have happened. We would get regular updates, calls and SMSs telling us exactly where a rare bird had been sighted. It was incredible that my wife and I had developed such an ardent passion for birds. I promise you our enthusiasm was boundless, and in our frenzied excitement we would drop absolutely everything in a heartbeat and race to the truck, sometimes driving for miles, to see if we could spot the unusual bird. It would seem that even my wife's housework was forsaken and put on hold if there was an interesting bird in our vicinity. I remember thinking to myself one day how much Tattletale had literally changed our lives, because my wife had blossomed and was so much less overwrought and wound up about managing the affairs of our home, and thankfully a little less preoccupied with the state of my expanding waistline. For a while I was able to get away with the odd burrito or packet of Oreos without my wife throwing a wobbly. We began to make so many brand new friends in the bird-watching community. My wife would sometimes be on the phone for absolute hours, with Tattletale perched on her shoulders, nibbling her ears affectionately, while she talked to fellow bird-watchers. The conversation was always the same. "Where did you see it? Did you hear its call? What was the colour like?" Polly and I are very lucky to live here in the mountain state from a bird-watching point of view, because we've seen so many rare birds. We have been privileged over the years to encounter some rather unusual birds. We've seen a northern saw, which is an owl that is so tiny it can fit into the palm of your hand. We've also observed the rose-breasted grosbeak, the Baltimore oriole, the golden-winged warbler, and some of the rarest wood warblers in the world. And not only did we have physical sightings of these birds, but even attained rare photographs of these incredible feathery wonders of nature's, of which my wife has enlarged and framed, putting in pride of place on the kitchen wall. Who would have thought that a feathery creature would turn up in our lives unannounced, move in and completely change our lives, so much for the better, in ways I never imagined possible. But weirder things have happened to people. One day my wife and I received a belated SMS that 2 pale blue Kerkuline warblers had been spotted in an area of forest which was about 45 minutes' drive from where we actually lived. My wife and I frantically climbed into the car, and as I drove she was finding all the details about this sighting from Owen, who had actually sighted the bird, and was extracting all the information from him that she possibly could. "Owen says it was spotted about 6 hours ago," she said, looking at me with a deflated look. "I think we've possibly left it too late. The birds have possibly already flown away. Just our luck. What a bummer." I could see that my wife was looking so desperately downcast, and I put my hand on her thigh and gave it a little squeeze. "It doesn't mean that we should give up," I said encouragingly. "You never know. It might still be there." My wife did not say anything, as her glazed eyes looked out of the car window with a vacant expression, and I could sense she was more than a little upset. "Look," I said, "even if we don't see the Kerkuline warbler, we may spot another unusual bird there." "But I want to see the Kerkuline warbler," said my wife. "Everyone in our group has seen the bird except for me. Now I'm going to miss it all over again. It's not fair. Before long, I was driving my truck down the most remote rocky road that was so precarious that it was jolting and wobbling all over the place, and the stones were beating violently against the undercarriage, but nothing was going to stop us for what we were planning to do. "Goodness, this really is remote," said my wife, glancing out of the window at the undulating verdant valleys and exquisite mountainous views. "It must have been spotted over there, in that thick area of wood green," said my wife. "Owen said the birdwatcher observed it perched on a cypress tree, and he said there are lots of different trees in that woods, but there's barely any cypresses, so it should be easy to spot the bird, if he's still perched up in that tree." As we ventured into the woods, my heart started pumping excitedly as the adrenaline coursed through my veins. This always seemed to happen to me on our bird-hunting expeditions, and it would seem it was no different for my wife, as her countenance looked eager and enthusiastic, full of hopeful anticipation. Words fail me to ever describe the magnificence of this remote wooded location, as it was off the charts in its wondrous beauty. I promise you this shaded retreat just took my breath away. The trees towered up into the clear blue firmament like tall regal skyscrapers, and their exquisite voluptuous trunks were swathed in resplendent carpets of rich velvety emerald moss. The vast canopy was splayed out like an elegant fan, and between the elevated branches sunlight twinkled and dappled the forest floor in a luminescent, subtle light. The forest floor was covered in rocky boulders and outstretched lacy ferns, along with some flowering purple mazes, which is native to the Himalayas, along with composite daisies with their distinctive purple fringes, and some flowering sage. My wife and I silently trailed through the wooded area, as we had learnt from bitter experience that some of the bird life got skittish if one got up too close. So we were very quiet as we trekked through this wood green. There were ancient hiking trails that were clearly not in use anymore, as they were so overgrown, and the trail signs were no longer even legible, and the wood on the signage was totally warped. I marvelled at this natural, wondrous oasis. Even if we didn't spot the Curculine warbler, I knew that just visiting this enchanting, magical sylvan was a complete pleasure. Much of the trail was very steep, surrounded by rocky boulders, and there was a pretty picturesque stream that meandered through the valley, and I could hear the sound of the white water jetting over the rocks. It was incredible. "I feel like we're in a magical place," whispered my wife. "If I was a Curculine warbler, I'd never leave it." "Shh," I whispered. "Hear that?" "Hear what?" asked my wife. "A whistling sound," I said. "It sounds like something or someone is whistling." We moved towards the sound, and I beckoned for my wife to hide, because someone was coming. And whatever or whoever it was, it sounded like something very heavy was walking up the path, and by heavy I mean something alarmingly big. I wasn't sure what it was, but I sensed that my wife and I needed to be very careful. We could hear the whistling getting closer and closer, and then we saw him, and I just remember my mouth hung open in astonishment. I knew I was observing a Bigfoot. This one was exceedingly different to most general descriptions I've ever heard over the years, because this Bigfoot was covered with long white hair, very similar in colour to that of a polar bear, but it wasn't an albino Bigfoot. It was blonde in colour, and it walked upright like a man, with long, slender, muscular legs, and a powerful V-shaped torso that rippled with muscle. He had the kind of body that would take hours of arduous, gruelling workouts in the gym to attain, rather like Arnold Schwarzenegger in better days. The critter looked much like a man, but there were ape-like influences to his appearance, most especially the overlong arms and the pyramid-shaped face. As he walked, he moved his arms backwards and forwards, and he seemed to glide with a seamless grace, almost as if he was floating. In that moment, I believe I was suspended in what seemed like an altered sense of consciousness, as my complete sense of bewilderment had hijacked my fear. I just thought, my God, what on earth am I seeing? For I had indeed been cynical about the critter, believing he was as bogus as the tooth fairy, and yet now I was seeing him larger than life in our reality. I could see that Polly was shaking like a jelly and was absolutely terrified, but I also could sense that she was in awe at the same time about what we were discerning. I beckoned for her to be very still. The critter then stopped whistling, and he seemed to be looking up in a Pacific tree, and he stood very still watching the tree with an expression of pleasure on his face. I pondered as to what he could be looking at, and then I heard 3 buzzy notes followed by 4 fast warbles, and then I realised to my amazement he must have spotted the Curculine warbler, and then the Bigfoot did the most extraordinary thing. He actually copied the warbler's song, and I could see a speck of light blue studding the Bigfoot, and the bird boldly stood on the edge of the branch and began to sing to it. I've never ever seen anything happen like that before, for indeed no bird has behaved like that to me, apart from our parrot. I could see that the Bigfoot was enamoured by the bird as much as we were, if we were watching it at such close quarters. He beheld it for a little longer, emulating its buzzes and warbles, with a delighted expression upon his leathery face. I discerned his skin colour was that of a Caucasian man, and I noted that the critter had deep-set green eyes, a distinct wrinkled brow ridge, a flat nose and thin lips. He did have a patch of black hair down the front of his torso in a long vertical line. I don't believe the critter was very old. I think he was a young but mature male. He glided through the woods whistling happily to himself, and my impression of him was that he was a gentle creature with a true appreciation of the natural world, and loving all the animals upon it. All of a sudden we saw the blue Curculine warbler fly past us as it almost followed the Bigfoot out of the wood green, but then it flew back to the tree it had perched on before. I was astonished, and my wife and I enjoyed watching it for 20 long minutes, until finally it flew away into the wood green, and we decided to call it a day. When my wife got back into the car, she exploded with excitement. "Did you see what I think we saw?" she asked. "We did indeed," I said. "It couldn't have been anything else." "But it was all white, and it had green eyes," she said. "You don't hear about Bigfoots like that." "Well, maybe they're like humans," I suggested, "with colours ranging from browns to blacks to blondes and reds. And maybe the blonde ones are more rare." "You know," my wife said, "I think you're right." I must say it's been about 5 years since we last saw the Bigfoot, but we still talk about it as if it happened yesterday. I will never be able to forget that critter, because it made an enormous impression on me. I realised also that it had such a huge appreciation for the natural world, which really made me respect him a lot. As you can imagine, I'm still battling with my weight 5 years on, and look like I'm heavily pregnant. My wife has reconciled herself to the fact that I must just have a dreadful metabolism, and is oblivious to the fact that when her back is turned away, I get into my truck and squirrel away a few delectable takeaways. My wife is forever reminding me of the athletic Bigfoot that we saw, and saying how lovely it would be if I would have a body to match his. I think to myself, "In your dreams, Polly. That is never going to happen." And as for Tattletale, he's still one of the greatest blessings in our lives, and I have surreptitiously managed to increase his vocabulary. When I bring my secret stash of takeaways into the house, I always say to him, "I'm a very bad boy, and what will Polly say?" And Tattletale is always saying to Polly, "I'm a bad boy. What will Polly say? I'm a bad boy. What will Polly say? I'm a bad boy. What will Polly say?" My wife thinks it's all terribly funny, but she doesn't know that Tattletale has told her my dark secret, so I really do have the last laugh. So there you are. That's my story. Dear Sarah, and all your lovely listeners, my name is Bernard, and I'm from Charleston in West Virginia, and have lived here pretty much all my life in a Georgian-style lower-floor apartment with a verdant courtyard garden in the French Quarter, which is on the southeast corner of the peninsula, with Broad, Meeting, East Bay and South Market Street as outer perimeters. I'm often described as a little eccentric, avant-garde and unorthodox kind of person, which I suppose is probably true. I'm also a very studious, well-read person with a passionate zeal for books, which may be why my apartment resembles a rather arresting, grandiose library with its lavish velvety red carpets, exquisite golden red striped upholstered armchairs, large marble fireplaces, and bookshelves bursting with books from bygone days, as well as more modern stuff, of course. I'm in my late 60s now, and have never married, nor have I sired any children, which of course has meant that over the years among many of my friends there has been idle speculation and gossip that I'm either a closet gay or asexual, which of course is not true, as nothing could be further from the truth. I think I just never met the right woman, which does happen, believe it or not. I was not prepared to just settle down with anyone just for the sake of appearances, or to prevent myself from becoming lonely or isolated. I mean, that would be ridiculous. One of my best friends, Peter, tried to encourage me to get married to a girl I met 20 years ago once, whom I dated for a short while. I remember him earnestly saying, "You don't want to end up all on your own," as to which I replied, "I don't want to be married to someone who could potentially make my life very miserable." I know being on your own does get a bad rap, and people think that such a solitary, bleak existence is desperately cheerless and sad, or morose, but that too is very false. If you have friends and you live alone, life can indeed be very enjoyable and pleasant, although one is inclined to become rather set in one's ways, which isn't altogether a good thing, I suppose. My strange story that ultimately led me to learn about an outlandish, stupendous Bigfoot encounter happened to me when I was driving in a remote area of Virginian countryside, after having visited a reclusive friend of mine who lives in an old log cabin in these parts, and is definitely more unconventional and even more eccentric than I am. On this occasion the heavens had opened, and it was raining very hard. I stopped my car to pick up a bedraggled-looking hitchhiker who was walking down a country lane in the pouring rain with a battered suitcase in her hand. I think she was walking to the bus stop, but I couldn't be sure. Even if it hadn't been raining, I would have stopped and offered the young lady a lift, because she looked so alone and so desperately sad. There was something about how small, fragile and vulnerable she looked on this rambling, quaint country road, surrounded by mountainous valleys and dreamy forests, that really got my attention. I could see her wet clothes were clinging to her body like rags, and her long dark hair hung limply around her face in ragatails. She did look a sorry sight, rather reminding me of a drowned kitten. Now I ask you, how could you drive past such a desperate sight? You would have to have a heart of stone to do so. "Would you like a lift?" I asked the young woman, opening the side door of my Jeep. "You're getting soaked to the skin. Climb in." The pretty young woman looked really grateful and climbed onto the seat with her small suitcase clasped in her hands, which she straddled to her knees on the front seat. "It's awfully kind of you," she said. "I'm soaked to the skin." "I can see that," I said. "The rain is coming down in buckets. It's getting nasty out there. Do you mind me asking you, where are you going?" I asked. "I don't really know," she said reflectively. "I was thinking I'd head for Charleston. I want to get as far away from here as I possibly can." "Is it that bad?" I asked. "I'm afraid so," she said. For a while I continued to drive, but I could tell that the woman was visibly upset. She kept wiping tears away from her blue eyes. They were covered in pink blotches that led me to believe that she had been crying considerably. "Are you all right?" I asked. "You do seem rather upset." "I'll be fine," she said, straightening up in her seat and staring blankly outside the window with a vacant expression on her face, as if she was trying very hard not to think at all. "Where are you going to be staying in Charleston?" I asked. "I've not thought that far ahead," she said. "I'll make my decisions when I finally get there." "Look," I said, "I don't want to interfere, nor do I want to put my nose in your business, but I do happen to have a spare room in my apartment in Charleston that you are more than welcome to use, while you find your bearings, if that helps, of course." The woman's face brightened. "Are you sure you don't mind? That would be a marvellous help." "How old are you?" I asked. "You're not too young to be running away from home, are you?" "How do you know I'm running away from home?" the woman asked me, looking bewildered. "Is it that obvious?" "I'm afraid so," I said. "The suitcase is a wee bit of a giveaway, shall we say?" "I'm 20, said the girl. "Good," I said. "At least you're old enough to make your own decisions. Do you mind me asking why you're running away? I know it's none of my business, but you know the saying, a problem shared is a problem halved. I am a good listener, you know." "You're not some kind of a therapist?" she asked, looking at me rather alarmed. "No, not at all. But I am a very good listener, as I said. Would you like to talk about it?" "Not really," she said. "Didn't think so," I said. "What's your name, by the way?" "I'm Bernard, and it's a pleasure to meet you, even if these are rather inauspicious conditions under the circumstances." "I'm Heidi," she said, "and ditto." Now that is an unusual name, I reflected. I think I quite like it, actually. For a long time we drove, and you could have heard a pin drop in the car. It wasn't an uncomfortable, prickly silence that needed to be broken, nor was it fraught with awkwardness, but it was simply two unpretentious, relaxed people choosing to just say nothing at all, which meant that we weren't uncomfortable, just quiet. "Are you married?" asked Heidi suddenly. "How would your wife feel about me staying over in your spare room? You don't have a habit of just bringing waifs and strays home, do you? Like abandoned cats, dogs, raccoons, or piteous people like myself?" "No, to both those questions. I've never been married. I live alone, nor do I rescue waifs or strays, although that might not be a bad idea, come to think of it. I've always rather fancied raising a raccoon. There's something about the dark patches around their eyes that really softens the heart and beguiles me ever so slightly." Heidi laughed. "I like them too," she said. "I always have." "You haven't got any ulterior motives in picking me up, have you?" she asked. "Just so that you know, I'm not that kind of a girl." I chuckled. "No offence, but you're young enough to be my daughter. I'm in my 40s, just so that you know." "Good," she said. "I just had to make sure. Sometimes people can end up in sticky situations when they get their wires crossed and misunderstandings arise. I do mean that some older men like younger women, if you know what I mean." "Well, not me," I assured her. "I tend to stick to women of my own age. It's a generational thing, you know." "You look a little brighter," I said. "When I first picked you up, you looked like you had the weight of the world on your shoulders back there on that remote country road, in the middle of nowhere, if you don't mind my saying." "You are very nosy," she said. "You're dying for me to tell you why I'm running away, aren't you? I can tell. You're just literally bursting at the seams to know why." I raised a quizzical eyebrow. "I'm a writer. I'm naturally nosy and snoopy by nature. I'm very interested in stories. Like yours, of course. As an aspiring novelist, I'll tell you this. I'm always looking for good fodder for my stories and fresh inspirational ideas." "You want a story?" said Heidi. "I'll give you one. And it's a true story too. And it's also about why I'm running away. And just so you know, I don't even care if you don't believe me." "Why wouldn't I believe you?" I said. "Because to an outsider like yourself, it might all seem nonsensical and fictitious, but I assure you it's true." "I highly doubt I would disbelieve you. You see, as a writer, Heidi, you have to open your mind to everything. Otherwise it restricts your creativity. Why don't you try me? I think you might be surprised how unbiased and non-discriminatory I can actually be." So this was Heidi's story that she shared with me on my journey back to Charleston. "I live on a farm close to where you actually picked me up," she told me. "We have several acres of cornfields and timberland there, and I live in a large colonial farmhouse. You know the type, 2 stories, whitewashed walls and a grey slate roof. I actually have 2 sisters and a brother, but they left home when I was still wearing diapers. My parents never planned for me, but I just came along unexpectedly. I suppose you would describe me as a late lamb. Growing up, it was very lonely for me, as you can imagine. I had no brothers and sisters, and my mother homeschooled me, so I didn't even get an opportunity of interacting with other kids my own age. My parents weren't even social or at all gregarious, and so I only got to see other kids at church, but I tended to just hide away from them. I was so painfully shy. My parents toiled and laboured arduously, managing all the affairs on our farm, so they just let me do my own thing after my studies. I would spend ages out there in the glorious woods, and it was my little home away from home, my little secret retreat or shaded verdant oasis, so to speak. And I loved it out there, as it was so tranquil and peaceful. I also enjoyed watching the deer, the squirrels and chipmunks, and all kinds of indigenous wildlife. Other kids might just go and sleep in their bedroom, but I would take a blanket and go and lie by the silvery stream on a smooth rocky outcrop and go to sleep there. I loved lying under the shade of the tall oak trees, listening to the pretty bird song and the white water crashing against the rocks. It was the best feeling in the entire world, and I even read my books and ate my sandwiches out there, as it was so serene and breathtakingly beautiful, almost like going to the beach, I suppose. How did your parents feel about you spending so much time in the woods? If it was my kid, I might be rather concerned. There are predators out there, surely." "They weren't bothered at all. They just let me be. I think they've already raised 3 children, and by the time I came along, they were enervated and quite simply exhausted. That's why they say the last child has it very easy, because the parents loosen the reins considerably. I know my elder sister Julie had it really tough, as both my parents were incredibly strict on her. I gather she had to be in bed by 6 sharp every night, but my parents were never bothered what time I went to bed. In truth, I think they barely noticed my coming or goings." "Well, go on with your story," I said. "I'm champing at the bit to hear it all." "One day when I was about 10 years old, I'd been reading my book by the stream, and I fell fast asleep by the water with a blanket over my body. For some strange reason, I've always needed to be covered when I go to sleep." "I'm a little like that myself," I agreed. "I don't like to be naked without a cover over my body, if you know what I mean." "Well, I suddenly just woke up because I felt something poking at me. And that was when I saw him. I couldn't believe what I was actually seeing. He was about 4 foot tall and covered in hazelnut hair with auburn highlights, and he was ever so cute. He had a shaggy coat of hair, exactly the same as an old English sheepdog. Have you ever seen an old English sheepdog before?" she asked me. "No, I can't say I have," I admitted. "I'm not au fait with all the dog breeds." "Never mind. All you really need to know about him is that his hair was incredibly shaggy. He definitely looked very human, but there were aspects to him that rather reminded me of an ape, like the overlong arms that he had, and the distinctive pyramid-shaped head, and, of course, his brow ridge. I was not remotely afraid of him. Maybe I should have been, but I wasn't. The creature was so friendly towards me, and had the most beautiful eyes that I've ever seen in my entire life. As I told you, I'm a reticent, reserved sort of person, but this little critter made me forget my self-effacing shyness. Before long, we became firm friends, and I would meet up with him at the same time every day, except for Sundays and Mondays, as for some reason he was never available on those days." "Well, where do you think he came from?" I asked. "Well, I know that his family are nomads and they travel all over the place, but they've lived on our land on and off for many generations in a cave there. I know the exact spot. It's close to the stream on a high rocky elevation overlooking the waterfall. I can see why they live there. It's as pretty as a picture, and the sizable cave is very inconspicuous. Most people would never even know it existed. That's how invisible it is." "If you don't mind me asking you, how do you actually know about this cave?" "Well, Peekaboo told me. He told me exactly where his family lived." "So, I take it that Peekaboo is your friend. Is that his real name?" "No, not at all. I can't actually pronounce his real name. He speaks a very strange language, but I do know a few words. But the trouble is they speak so fast. I called him Peekaboo because he always enjoys playing that game, so it kind of stuck. Besides, it really suits him." "It's an ingenious name. I like it," I said. "Please go on. I'm enjoying your story." "Well, as I said, it started from when I was about 10, my friendship with Peekaboo, I mean. I kept my companionship with him a very firm secret, as I didn't want my family to know about him, as I knew they would disapprove. Peekaboo was also as shy and reticent as I am. His kind really are. They tend to prefer to keep in the shadows and not be seen. I only saw his family a handful of times myself, but Peekaboo told me they liked me a lot, but weren't so sure about the rest of my family. They never really liked or trusted my dad, although they thought he was very funny. They would see him a lot, although he never knew they were scrutinizing him. He would regularly frequent the woods for hunting purposes. They said he was an atrocious hunter. Peekaboo's family had never seen anything like it before, and they would laugh heartily at how terrible he was at hunting and how he scared all the wildlife away because he was so cack-handed with his rifle, although he falsely always assumed that he was an accomplished hunter. I do remember Peekaboo concocted some extraordinary reenactments of my father's cloddish, bungling attempts to hunt. Oh, I laughed so much. My stomach was hurting, it was aching so much. Peekaboo would pretend to be holding a rifle, and then he would swagger all over the place like a drunk, illustrating in his remarkable performance how ham-handed and ungainly my dad actually was. It was so hilarious to watch. Sometimes his entire family felt so sorry for my ponderous dad that when he shot something that he hadn't killed, Peekaboo's mother would actually go and finish the injured animal off gently and leave it lying there for my dad to collect, so that my father would assume he'd actually killed it and would be none the wiser. The funny thing is, my father believes he's a great hunter, but he's so butterfingered on that rifle of his, it's a joke, really. "How do you know about all this, when Peekaboo did not speak any English?" I asked. "I'm not really sure. I think Peekaboo was telepathic, because he always knew what I was thinking, and when I asked him a question, the answer would just flood into my mind in audible words. That's how he speaks to me all the time. It was as natural as speaking out loud, but I've never ever had that experience with anybody else before, only with Peekaboo. I could look at Peekaboo and he knew exactly what I was saying. It was that direct, and then the answer would flood into my mind." "It sounds like he was telepathic to me." "How extraordinary. That must have been quite an experience. That is unique, I must say." Everything was unique about Peekaboo. He was my best friend in the entire world, as we would do absolutely everything together, and he made me laugh so much because he was so good at imitating me. If I did something, he would often duplicate what I'd done, and seeing the replay was so funny, and his reenactions of my father's precarious hunting sessions were so hysterical. I promise you, Peekaboo's family would stop literally everything to watch my father go on a hunt, as for them it was like live entertainment. It would be like us stopping our daily rituals to listen to our favourite television programme. I gather they would whistle 3 times and make 4 wood knocks, and then they would all know it was showtime with my father. Peekaboo's family could not wait to watch him make a complete idiot of himself with that rifle of his. I gather for days afterwards they would be reenacting my father's feeble attempts to kill an animal. They found it so funny. "What kind of things did you and Peekaboo do together?" I asked curiously. "Well, we would play Peekaboo, obviously, hide and seek. We'd swim in the stream, throw pebbles, play marbles, and all kinds of things. I introduced him to games, and he was very good at puzzles and stuff like that." "Now that is interesting. You mean he knew which piece of the puzzle fit exactly where?" "Exactly," said Heidi, "and he was fast too. He was an incredibly intelligent creature, but after a while I didn't see him as much different to myself. I saw him as completely human, wearing long hair instead of clothing, that's all. Although there were notable differences between us. I mean, he had the most enviable padded feet, that he could walk over any terrain he liked without getting torn apart like ours would, and he could walk through briars or thorns without getting his skin ripped, because of his shaggy coat, of course. I remember once we were playing hide and seek together, and would you believe it, he was hiding in a hedge of thorns of all things. Would you believe it that there were no cuts on him, only thorns tangled up in his shaggy hair, which did get badly tangled from time to time. I sometimes brought scissors in the wood to cut them out for him. Peekaboo could also run on 4 legs as easily as on 2, and he was the fastest runner you've ever seen. And when he grew big, he would take me on piggybacks everywhere. It was so fun. I remember I used to tap him on the top of his shoulder to get him to go faster, and it was incredible. He would run like the wind on the rocky terrain, and he was smoother than riding on a horse. "Now that is something," I said. "Another thing about Peekaboo, he knew how to hide. One time he pretended to be a tree, and I couldn't find him anywhere. I kept darting past him, missing him every single time. I just couldn't see him. He thought that was so amusing. I know his family pretend to be trees, and hunters never ever see them. He told me that once, and I believe every word of it, based on my own experience." "Well, you know what they say about monkeys and apes. They can hide in plain sight," I said. "You're right. His family knew absolutely everything about my family. I mean details about my family, like the cars they drove and what they did on the farm. But my family knew nothing about Peekaboo. They knew nothing about him, nor his family. Nothing at all. I think his family could observe everything, but remain hidden. It's quite a skill, you know." "That is interesting. Tell me, when did you meet the members of his family? Well, I met the father once when we were swimming in the stream together, splashing around. He glided over to watch us, and he didn't hide from me at all. He sat on the rocky outcrop with his eyes pinned on the both of us. Oh, I began to panic when I saw him. Oh, because he was so scary to look at. He was enormous. I mean, really, really colossal. A very intimidating but majestic creature, if ever I did see one. How big would you say he was? I asked. I know you're going to think I'm exaggerating, but I promise you I'm not. I think he was about 9 foot. I could be wrong, of course, and about 800 pounds. He was covered in hair, just like Peekaboo, only it was of a much darker tone, but it did have the red highlights. He also had bald patches on his knee area and under his arms, where the arms rubbed together, you know what I mean, and his shoulders were gargantuan. I'd say they were 4 foot across. He was impressive looking, powerful, very strong, you know. What did he do? Well, he watched us playing together. He seemed pleased to see Peekaboo so very happy, and he just chatted to him for a few minutes in their curiously strange language, and then he just glided away. He was telling Peekaboo to get back soon to the cave because there was fresh squirrel on offer, but Peekaboo had already eaten lunch with me that day because I always brought him peanut butter and jam sandwiches on brown bread. Oh, he loved those, but forget about white bread. He couldn't stand the stuff. I think it was too refined for his liking. What other human food did he like? Oh, Peekaboo just loved bacon sandwiches and brown bread. Best of all, he liked them better than anything else I've ever seen him eat. He also adored my mother's walnut cake and her oat and raisin cookies. And, of course, he was very partial to peanut butter. He liked fruits and nuts and stuff like that. Oh, and he particularly liked salted chips. He'd lick the salt off them first, and he adored just eating crispy bacon on its own. I think all animals enjoy salt, I said. That's why they have salt licks. What I don't understand is how you managed to keep Peekaboo such a secret from your families for so very long. Oh, it was easier than you think. You see, Peekaboo always knew when any of my family members were coming. He'd be gone or hiding in plain sight before my dad even came to grab me out of the woods. They did not mind me playing there because they saw it made me so happy. After Peekaboo and I became friends, my parents saw a monstrous change in my personality, a good one, of course, because even in church I'd stopped hiding from all the other kids and was interacting more. They couldn't make any sense of it, and even encouraged me once to invite a friend home for tea. I never wanted to play with anybody else but Peekaboo. I loved him so much. It's hard to explain, but he was like a brother to me. Well, that makes sense. What about Peekaboo's mother? Did you ever meet her? Not many times, but I do remember the first time I saw her. She was peeking at me from behind a tree, and I saw this head peering and looking at me. Peekaboo ran to the tree and dragged his mother out to introduce her to me. I remember she was so bashful and terribly shy. At first she avoided eye contact with me, but then she did look directly in my eyes, and I could see incredible kindness. On one occasion she came up to me and placed this beautiful stone on my hand, which was a gift from her. It was like a turquoise crystal, and it was magnificent. I've no idea where she got it from, but I've still got it today. Sounds like some kind of a semi-precious stone that's found here in Virginia. It might be worth something. You should check it out. Never. I want to keep it forever. It has such sentimental value to me. It reminds me of Peekaboo and his family. Even if you gave me $1 million, I'd never ever part with it. Well, that's very understandable, given your special relationship with Peekaboo. The woman suddenly burst into tears. That's just it. I can never have a friendship with Peekaboo ever again, because of my horrible, horrible father. That's why I'm running away, because of him. If I never ever see him again, it'll be too soon. Well, tell me exactly what happened. Well, my father decided to go scouting in the woods to look for deer scat. He wanted to go hunting this Saturday afternoon, and Peekaboo was in the stream, taking a swim. Of course, Peekaboo is very big these days. I never noticed it growing up, because I was with him so much, but he is big. I think he might even be bigger than his father now. I'm not really sure. I gather my father saw him getting out of the stream, and they were only standing yards away from each other. My father began to scream, and for a moment he stared at Peekaboo, and then he ran out of the grove as fast as he could and told us that his legs felt like blocks of cement, they were so heavy beneath him. And he simply couldn't move for a while, and then he began to run. He was certain that Peekaboo was going to kill him, which could not have been further from the truth, but I guess Peekaboo's appearance scared the living daylights out of him. Well, I suppose you can understand that. Well, my mother tried to calm him down, but my father was shaking so much. Even I couldn't imagine what on earth was wrong with him. My mother called out the doctor, who gave him some tranquilizers. He said my dad had had some kind of a terrible shock. It was only the next morning my father told us what had actually happened. My mother gave him a few shots of whiskey to ease and subdue his frazzled nerves, and that seemed to help him to talk. He told us he'd seen a very dangerous monster in the wood, bigger than a bear, that looked like a humanoid ape, and that something needed to be done about it immediately. That was when he began to call the sheriff and so forth, who seemed to think that my father was very drunk. But later that day we did receive a confidential call from a man in the force who assured my father that, in fact, the matter would be dealt with as soon as possible, and he'd be sending the military, who would be coming around in the evening to eliminate the critter for him. "You are joking," I said. "What did you do?" Well, I was terrified. I immediately ran into the Sylvan and called out Peekaboo. I just shout out his name very loudly, and he always responds if he's there, of course. "Did he come?" I asked. "Oh, at once. And when he saw my face, he could read my thoughts, and he hung his head in sadness. We embraced in the way humans do, and I cried and cried into his large chest. He then called out to his family. They have an emergency call. It's 3 owl hoots and a whistle. And before you could say Jack Robinson, they were all there. This was the first time I'd actually seen the entire family together, and they all gathered around me, very solemnly. They knew something serious was up. Peekaboo chattered away to them and pointed towards me, and they all tapped me on the shoulder 2 times. Once was for thank you for telling us what you told us, and twice for saying goodbye. As they're Normans, they had no baggage, and they were on their way as quickly as that, leaving behind their life on our farm, in the twinkling of an eye, to embrace pastures new. They didn't have any choice in the matter, of course. I could feel the tears welling up in my eyes, because this was such a beautiful story, blighted by a father's complete misunderstanding of the critter, and his daughter's incredible relationship with it. "Did the military come to your house?" "Oh yes, they came late that night. They arrived in a large army truck, with very high-caliber rifles, and they were in the Sylvan for a long time, several hours, I think. There were about 6 or 7 of them. They found no sign of the critter, because of course they'd all gone by then. But they gave my dad a card, telling him to call them if he saw the creature again, and they would exterminate him." "They're talking about my best friend here," said Heidi, beginning to sob inconsolably. "Good. Cry," I said. "It's good for you. You need to let it all out. You need to release that pain, or it'll destroy you. Believe me, I know all about it." Heidi began to weep for quite a long time. "I'm just going to miss Peekaboo so much. I can't imagine my life without him. I loved him so much." "Look, these things happen. Sometimes we have to move on," I said. "Maybe Peekaboo and his family stayed for so long because of your incredible relationship with him. And they saw how bonded the 2 of you were, and they didn't have the heart to leave for his sake. But I'm sure they travel and go to places all the time, and they only stayed so long because of you." "I think you're probably right." "Oh, of course I am," I said. "My father's the reason why I decided to run away," she said. "I can't even look at him in the eyes without feeling this intense hatred and loathing for him. He's ruined my life. I'm not sure he has any idea that he's upset you so much. You shouldn't be so hard on him. He was only doing what he thought was best, even though it was dreadfully misguided. He had no idea about your friendship with Peekaboo. Did you leave a note for your parents, so at least they won't worry themselves sick about you?" "Yes, I did. I told them I was starting a brand new life, and I wouldn't be back. I said that calling the military to kill that critter in the woods was very vindictive. I didn't say why, of course, because my father would never have understood my friendship with Peekaboo, But I did end off the note telling my dad, "You have no idea what a lousy hunter you really are, but I do." "Well, I guess that got him thinking," I laughed. "Look at it like this. You saved Peekaboo and his entire family from being wiped out by the military. That's got to be a good thing, surely." "I suppose that is true," said Heidi, wiping away her tears. "What I don't get is why you actually believe my story. That does surprise me, I have to say." "Oh, I believe your story, dear. You know why? Because I've come to these parts very regularly to visit my friend in this part of the world all the time. And one day, out of the blue, a critter crossed my path fitting the description of the humanoid ape that you described to perfection. I remember that day as if it was yesterday. It shifted my view of reality completely around. I remember the creature just looked at me with wide, curious, deep-set dark eyes. It displayed no animosity, but I must admit I was very startled. On the contrary, it seemed rather congenial, and I do remember that it was covered in hazelnut hair, with, as you say, an auburn hue. And it had hair-covered breasts, and a very certain patch of white hair on its chest. I do remember that." "Was the hair the shape of a crescent moon?" asked Heidi excitedly. "Yes, actually I believe it was." "You saw Peekaboo's mother! I can't believe it! You saw her!" Fast forward to several weeks, and Heidi stayed at my home for 3 long months and found a great job in the city of Charleston, and about 3 years later she got married to a delightful man who worked as a doctor in the local town. I gather she did make up with her parents, but I don't think she ever entirely forgave her father for what happened. It would seem that Peekaboo and his family had long since gone, and possibly laid down roots elsewhere. All that happened a very long time ago, because I think I was about 40-something at the time, and now I'm in my late 60s. Heidi and I are still great friends to this day, and I did ask for very special permission to share this story with you and all your listeners, and she was in agreement, on the understanding that she may remain anonymous. Of course you know that the critter that she encountered was a Bigfoot. So there you are. That's my story. Dear Sarah and all your lovely listeners, my name is Brian, and I'm from Kentucky, which is the southeastern interior portion of North America, which borders Virginia to the Midwest and southeast, Tennessee to the east, Missouri to the west, Illinois to the northwest, and Indiana and Ohio to the north. Our weather here is described as humid subtropical climate, and we are very lucky living in this part of the world, as the Ohio River nourishes and feeds our land bountifully, and has done so for many centuries, and this can be seen in the resplendent richness of the land. The Appalachian Mountains also offers a plethora of benefits for the rich earth, like fresh water sources, indigenous diverse animal species and habitat, as well as renewable energy, and last but not least the benefits of countless hiking trails and exquisite breathtaking views. I mean, what is there not to like? I have lived here in Kentucky all my life, and I raised my family in the city of Somerset, which is in Pulaski County, and I've always liked it here, because it's not too big, nor is it too small. It's an exquisite part of the world to live, because there is beautiful open countryside here, prairies, marinas, parks, silvery lakes, waterfalls, and so much more. My wife Daisy and I have raised our 2 sons in a rural, rustic lifestyle that was easygoing and carefree, but with structure, routine, boundaries, and rules. When they became teenagers, one of my sons, Eddie, was always getting into all kinds of dreadful trouble, while my other son thrived in life, succeeded in school and sports, and became the most reliable, trustworthy boy, aspiring to become a surgeon one day, and focusing on all his degrees. Eddie, on the other hand, was as directionless as a bird without wings, hopping from one plant pot to the next, and getting caught up in all kinds of precarious situations, and nearly being eaten by the cat along the way. All I can say is it's a good job that cats have 9 lives, because Eddie has been through hundreds of scrapes and near misses in his life, much like a cat. Naturally, this has become worrisome for both my wife and I, because we knew it was only a matter of time before trouble came knocking on our door, and it seems we didn't have to wait for very long. How could 2 boys raised by the same diligent, assiduous and punctilious parents like ourselves, who emphatically believed we were doing a great job, turn out so differently. Most people believe that parents are entirely responsible for the way that their children turn out in the long term. And to a degree I believe that they are right, but sometimes no matter what you do and how much prudent discipline you enforce on your children, and no matter how hard you try, sometimes one of your kids can turn into the dreaded bad apple. The best way I can explain it to you is like having an orchard of apples that you fertilise and fastidiously take care of as best as you can, and most of your apple trees produce a fine, illustrious, superior crop. One or two let you down continuously and keep producing noxious, defiled and rotten fruit, and despite your very best efforts, they keep failing you. Does that make you an ineffectual, impotent farmer? Most certainly not. Sometimes it just is what it is. Some suggest that difficult children are brought upon us to teach us life lessons and to help us face adversity. And if that's the case, let me say this, I've had quite enough. I must confess, when it comes to my kids, irrespective of their bad behaviour, you never stop loving them, and as a father, I would move the world for both of them. I believe all the problems started for Eddie when he was about 15 years old. He began to smoke cannabis, drink copious amounts of alcohol, and experiment liberally with drugs. He would also hang around the most dreadful lowlives that you've ever seen. There were times he ended up in a prison cell overnight for drunk disorderly behaviour. So growing up, our obstinate and willful son did give us a great deal of grief and cause us undue heartbreak and stress. Yet I've seen many more parents dealing with kids far more challenging than Eddie, so one has to be grateful for small mercies, however small they may be. I would say that my hair turned white overnight after Eddie spent his first night in a prison cell. But after he overdosed on drugs and was involved in a car accident, of which one of his friends was charged with driving under the influence of alcohol, I was beginning to anticipate that the drama and upheaval, not to mention calamity, was very much likely to follow Eddie around, like an ominous black shadow wherever he went in life. I knew it was going to drag him down on his journey, and it would seem I was right in the short term. My strange, incredulous story that ultimately led to my Bigfoot encounter happened when I received that emergency call, that call that every parent dreads from the hospital. For a moment I feared the very worst, and thought that this time my son had finally run out of luck, or lost his 9 lives, so to speak. I was almost certain he was dead, and my heart was in my mouth as I hung on to my cell phone for dear life, almost too terrified to listen to the words that I was about to hear. I remember my wife was as white as a sheet, and her eyes as round as an owl's. Imagine my monumental relief when I was informed by the doctor that Eddie was very badly injured and was in hospital awaiting multiple surgeries, as he had been mauled by a bear. "What, a bear?" cried my wife, looking aghast. "How the heck did that happen? Poor Eddie." We immediately raced over to the hospital to see our precious son, and my wife was smothering him with so much affection, rather like a pampered pooch. I think she was so heartily relieved that he was still with us, and still on the earth plane. My son was a horrific sight to behold, and was black and blue from serious bruising, and he looked as if he'd been through a mince grinder, because he looked so beaten up, and the doctor seemed satisfied that he had indeed been mauled by a bear. "Hello, I'm very pleased to meet you. I'm Dr. Baker," said the doctor, shaking my hand very vigorously. "Your son is going to be needing several long surgeries, I'm afraid. He's very lucky to be alive. That bear really did give your son a very big thrashing." "But he's going to be fine, isn't he?" I asked. "He should be all right. He should be very good, given his age, and he's still young. The bones should heal well. I would imagine he'll be as right as rain in no time at all." "Thanks, Doc," I said. I was indeed very grateful that Eddie was alive and with us. But when I began to ask my son what had happened to him, I noticed that he became very guarded, defensive and uptight. I knew immediately he was hiding something, but what I couldn't imagine. I knew instinctively when my son was not telling me the truth. He'd always twitch and rub the area above his chin pensively, and avoid looking directly into my eyes. "I told you, Dad, it was a bear," he snapped in a touchy voice. "Well, how did you end up being charged by a bear?" I asked. "That's what I want to know." "I was at the wrong place at the wrong time, that's all," You know the deal? No, actually I don't. Tell me, I said. Tell me, what is the deal? I don't want to talk about it right now, said Eddie, being incredibly evasive and grabbing his water bottle to avoid talking any further. Something's not right, I told my wife when I returned home that night. Eddie's as prickly as a hedgehog and as neurotic and as skittish as a raccoon. He looks like one too, with that black bruising around his eyes. You're right, said my wife. He's definitely hiding something. But what? I can't imagine. This was when we unanimously decided to call one of Eddie's friends, a young man called Howie, who he used to hang around with all the time. He was one of Eddie's more likeable friends. Most of them I didn't like at all. I knew I could railroad or persuade the boy, if you like, to let the cat out of the bag after a few beers. Howie was a garrulous young man whose tongue was capable of loosening considerably, and so this is what he told me after we'd offered him several beers. Before long, I'm glad to say that he became obligingly loquacious and voluble whilst remaining remarkably sober, but after a few drinks he seemed to enjoy prattling away. We decided to go poaching, he said, letting out a loud chuckle. You decided to do what? I asked. To go poaching, he said. We thought it would be fun. Son, it's illegal, I said, and it's wrong, but don't let that stop you, I said, sarcastically, feeling a growing sense of disgust that my beloved Eddie had been out poaching with his friends. What on earth was he thinking? I had not raised him to behave like this. Sir, if you're going to be all judgmental on us, I won't tell you anything else, because believe me, Eddie will never ever tell you what happened if I don't. Well, go on, I said. Tell me everything, and I promise you I won't pass any judgment on you. I need to know what happened. Well, Rory told us he knew this wonderful place where we could go poaching, he said. There were some big buck there, and some hefty-looking turkeys, so one way or another we would not leave empty-handed, or penniless, he chuckled. We were very excited, because we knew we would make a fast buck or two, and it seemed like easy money. We arrived at this very wooded place with lots of trees, wilderness, and a large lake. We did not want our truck to be seen, so we parked it behind a broken wall, and then we made our way into the woods. But they did not feel right. What do you mean they didn't feel right? I asked. Well, personally, I find woods always tend to be cheerful places with pretty birdsong, but there was something menacing about this place. It was beautiful, don't get me wrong, but it gave me the creeps, and there were funny things in the wood that made it seem even more oppressive and menacing. What kind of funny things? I asked. Well, strange pieces of broken timber made into crosses on the trees, and even on the ground. It was like pieces of wood were blocking our path. It gave you the impression that it was saying, "Get out." It just wasn't very welcoming, and it was rather indifferent. If you felt that way, why did you not leave at once? I've always told Eddie to listen to his gut. Well, I did tell Eddie and Rory that we should leave at once. The place felt rarely off, but they weren't listening. They told me I was being illogical and overreacting, and the strange timber crosses were made by kids fooling around and trying to scare people, and that I was just getting into a tizzy. That's what they told me. Well, what happened next? I asked. Well, we found 2 very sizable dead turkeys that had recently been killed lying there on the ground, and they were so fresh their bodies were still warm to the touch. We thought we'd hit the jackpot because they'd only just been killed, and their necks had been snapped off, which was odd, because how does a hunter get to snap a wild turkey's neck, I ask you? You have to shoot the things. They fly away very fast when they get startled. So the manner in which they were killed was an enigma, but we didn't ponder over that conundrum. Not for long, because we had struck a big deal, and we weren't going to look a gift horse in the mouth. I groaned. So that's what this is about. You stole the hunter's turkeys, and you ended up in a nasty brawl over a couple of turkeys. Is that what happened? Sir, it wasn't quite like that. Well, not as you think anyway. But we did decide to take the hunter's turkeys, as he wasn't around, so why not? I knew it, I said. You were illegally poaching, and now you chose to pilferage a hunter's turkeys. Whatever next? No wonder you got yourself into trouble. The problem with you kids is you just don't ever think before you act. Do you want me to go on or not? Said Howie, looking heated. Go on, I said. Well, all of a sudden we heard this terrible sound, sir. It was like the ground heaved and quaked and rumbled, like it was an earthquake. There's only one way I can describe it to you. We heard these heavy feet thundering towards us. It sounded like an elephant charging in the thicket. You could feel that whatever this thing was, it was huge and dangerous. All of a sudden we smelt its pungent, vile odour, and then we saw it. Oh, so this is when you encountered the angry bear. Sir, this was not a bear. It was Bigfoot. Say that again, I said, almost choking on my whiskey. It was Bigfoot, sir. Are those even real, dear? Asked my wife, looking perturbed. Is not Bigfoot just a creature of legend? This was no legend, ma'am. This was Bigfoot. I know it's hard to believe, but it's true. And I promise you I would rather have faced a bear any day of my life than this capricious, embittered thing, because it was quite literally bristling. It was seething so much, like a rabid dog. It was as mad as hell. I watched in horror as Howie began to tremble violently as he recalled what happened, as if he was reliving the event all over again. Calm down, son, I said, giving him a shot of brandy to calm down his nerve. Carry on with your story. You're doing well, son. I know it's not easy, but I need to hear it all in detail to make sense of what happened. Well, this bearish, cantankerous critter was colossal, sir. It was growling at us. Its lips rolled back and it was showing us its teeth, and its nostrils were flaring. I told Rory to drop the turkeys because I knew they were his, and this was why the Bigfoot was so pugnacious and hot under the collar. We had stolen his kill. Rory just refused to drop the turkeys because he wanted them so much. He told Eddie to shoot the Bigfoot dead. He kept screaming, "Kill him, Eddie, kill him now." Your son began to freak out, sir. He couldn't shoot straight. His hands were wobbling so very much. But he still began to fire at the critter. But it was like the bullet landed in the critter's arm, and it had no effect. It was almost as if the bullet was like a mosquito bite to the creature. He didn't seem at all hurt, but he became very angry indeed. Oh, no, I groaned. You shot the Bigfoot, didn't you? Oh, how could you be so silly? How could you be so silly? What happened next? Well, by then Rory did drop the turkeys. He'd become so terrified, and the vengeful critter went straight for your son and picked him up, hurling him into the bushes. Actually, to be honest, I think he got off lightly. The creature could have been way more aggressive, because this thing was so big, if he hit you, it was bound to cause you major physical problems. Anyway, he let out a thunderous growl. He then retrieved his turkeys and glided away. That was when Rory and I went to your son's rescue. In truth, sir, we thought he was dead. Well, he should have been dead. He was lucky to be alive, because that Bigfoot was so strong. Really strong. I mean, powerful, big, huge. As you can imagine, as a father, it was enigmatical to process emotionally, never mind mentally, the inscrutable things I had just been told about Howie. Whilst I knew that my son had done everything to exacerbate the Bigfoot and had behaved in a deplorable way that only invited trouble and had clearly provoked and antagonized the critter, I was still a father who was naturally very protective towards my son, despite the very fact that he'd failed to engage his common sense. I was now determined to extract my revenge on my son's behalf and kill the Bigfoot that had nearly cost him his life. And so it was that I insisted that Howie showed me exactly where this incident had transpired, and that he took me to the spot. As you can imagine, at first he was very reluctant to go back to the scene of the crime, but with a few $100s in bribery money, he was very easily persuaded to lead me to the location. It's amazing what money can do with kids. "What are you doing?" said my wife. "Don't do anything stupid. Leave that Bigfoot alone, I beg you. You're no better than any of the poachers if you venture out on private land. What you're doing is imbecilic. You could get killed. Has that even crossed your mind for a moment?" It would seem that every evening when the sun went down, I went in search of that Bigfoot. I never saw sight nor sound of him, or his kind for 2 long weeks for that matter. You would think that with the passing of time that my anger would ultimately subside, but you would be wrong. You would think that I would calm down, but I think as a father your desire is to naturally protect your children no matter what, even when they're in the wrong. I was determined to kill the Bigfoot, come hell or high water, and extract my revenge, no matter what. The rage bubbled beneath me, like a molten volcano waiting to burst its banks and spew out its lethal lava. I was also champing at the bit to extract my revenge, as no one hurts my son without paying a costly price. Then one evening I hit pay dirt. I knew the critter was around, because I smelt that strange pungent odour that Howie had warned me about. And also for the first time in 2 whole weeks, the wood green had become ominously quiet, as all the sounds of the crickets and frogs had subsided. Armed with my high-caliber rifle and wearing my headlamp, I moved ever forward stealthily, darting quietly from one tree to another, making very certain to be as quiet as possible. All of a sudden I heard this strange chattering sound. For a moment I thought that there were people in the woods speaking Chinese or Mandarin, or clearly someone was having a conversation. I moved very cautiously towards the noise, as quietly as I possibly could. I'd like to mention that I was covered in an odour eliminator that I used for hunting that has always worked well for me in the past, in ensuring that animals are oblivious to my presence. Whether this helped or not, I have no idea. It was then that I saw them, and there were 4 of them, mother, father, and 2 sons. It was a family of Bigfoot, and I couldn't believe what I was beholding. The thing that caught me off guard the most, more than anything else, that despite their gargantuan size, and the fact that they were covered in hair, they were so alarmingly human-like. I wasn't expecting that at all. I was always under the impression that they were like hairy apes, but in my opinion, this was not the case. Granted, they did look more like primitive man covered in long hair, but in my opinion the humanness in these creatures was utterly remarkable, completely overtaking any ape-like influences, for they were so much more human. The male was the largest at about 9 foot tall, and the female was 6 foot high, but the 2 young critters were only about 3 feet, and they were covered with long flowing brown hazelnut hair. I watched in awe as this family of Bigfoot interacted together, and it reminded me of my own family. The 2 little critters climbed up their father's back and began to sift through his hair, almost as if they were looking for fleas or nits, and the father was groaning in absolute pleasure as his 2 kids played and pulled and tugged at his hair. He clearly enjoyed the attention he was receiving. The female critter was chatting away, reminding me of a garrulous wife. She never stopped gassing. It would seem that the female Bigfoot was equally as bad as my own wife, because she didn't stop once to draw breath, but went on and on chattering. I think the other Bigfoots were listening to her, or if they weren't, they were pretending to, as I do with my wife from time to time, when I say, "Yes, dear," but haven't heard a word she's actually said. I realised that this father was the critter that I wanted to take out, but he didn't look like such a bad fellow after all, from where I was standing. I could discern he really adored his 2 younglings, and his partner as well, and that was when I realised there was no way that I could possibly shoot this critter. I would be depriving 2 younglings of a loving father, and a female of her beloved partner. It seemed so wrong, and I couldn't do it. The problem was, these critters were way too human for my liking. I retreated out of the woods, returning back to my car, and I realised one thing from my experience, is that every single parent out there does the best for their kids. We try our level best to protect them and lead them down the right path, but in the end our kids have to take responsibility for the choices they invariably make. I am no longer angry with that Bigfoot, who was only doing what all fathers try to do, and that is to provide for their families. And how can you blame him for that? He was providing those turkeys for them, which my child was trying to take away from him. He naturally lashed out. That is what I began to see. For some bizarre reason, Eddie seems to have been knocked into shape by that big male Bigfoot, because he's making better choices in his life all of a sudden. Perhaps being close to death, he realised what really mattered. He chose to become a physiotherapist and realised that this is what he was desirous to do after receiving physiotherapy for all his injuries. Isn't it funny how life has a weird way of working out in the end? So there you are. That's my story. Dear Sarah, and all your lovely listeners, my name is Grayson, although people often call me Gray for short, and I'm from North Carolina, which is situated in the southeastern part of the United States and located in the Piedmont region, bordered by West Virginia, the coastal plain to the east, and the Appalachian Mountains to the west, with Charlotte as our main city. North Carolina is without question an exquisite part of the world, with beautiful vistas, scenic imposing mountains, dreamy forests, awe-inspiring sunsets, and shorelines that stretch for miles, and so much more. I grew up in a rural area here with my two older sisters, Bonnie and Tabitha. I was raised in the 80s on a small sweet potato farm by both my parents. We lived in a rather enchanting old shabby farmhouse, but although charming, it wasn't in the best condition. It was in desperate need of a loving makeover and renovation. But my parents kept stalling any building projects. They simply hated the idea of all the appalling upheaval and chaos that a building project would obviously ensue, not to mention the steep crippling costs of renovation that they would sooner rather avoid. We were not wealthy by any manner of means, and money was always rather tight, as our sweet potatoes were not a vast sizable enough crop to procure a large enough profit for all of our needs. Yet we could not complain about anything, because life was rarely kind to us. We lived in an exquisite rural location, surrounded by gravel roads, ubiquitous areas of natural forest, creeks, ponds, silvery streams, verdant valleys and prairies, and for a young boy, the natural world was my quintessential playground, as we would go hiking, camping, mountain biking, exploring, fishing and engaging in all manner of outdoor pursuits, which invariably is what my family did over the years. One day my father randomly announced that my Uncle Teddy was coming to stay with us, and the news seemed incredibly exciting to the all of us, as we had never met our uncle before. He lived in a quaint village in Derbyshire in England. He was initially from the States like my father, but had fallen in love with an English girl at university, and they had subsequently married and never had any children of their own. "Now I want you to be very nice to your Uncle Teddy when he arrives," my father announced. "He's going through a very hard time at the moment and needs all the emotional support he can get. Do you understand? No games, no tricks, no funny business with him." We all nodded our heads in unison, not really comprehending what on earth my father was going on about. I was to learn from eavesdropping in on my parents' conversation that Uncle Teddy was going through a tumultuous, turbulent divorce. "I never did like that pompous English girl," I heard my mother say. "There was something about her that rubbed me up the wrong way. But to cheat on Ted like that, it's quite horrifying, and with a woman of all things, that's got to be the worst thing of all. I mean, it doesn't get more humiliating than that." "Well, I think it's been over for a very long time," my father reflected. "I think the cheating was the final nail in the coffin, and was the catalyst that brought the relationship to a head. I think he'll be glad it's all finally over. He needs to move forward now and leave the past behind him. Onwards and upwards, as they say." "I'm sure you're right," said my mother. "But even so, relationships are not easy to get over, are they? I don't know what I'd do if you cheated on me. It would tear me apart." "Lucky you won't have to find out, dear," said my father, kissing my mother tenderly on the cheeks. "That's never going to happen, because I love the bones off you, my sweetheart." I must admit, when my Uncle Ted arrived at our home, even though I'd never actually met him before, he did look rather battle-weary, rather like a traumatised soldier returning from an arduous stint of duty in Vietnam, who had seen way too much and was overwhelmed by the issues of life. I could tell my languished uncle was so sad and heartbroken. He was pleased to see us, though, and remembered us when we were little. He brought us handbags all the way from Carnaby Street, made from potato sack fabric, along with T-shirts and the most fantastic posters of London punks that we just loved. My uncle's appearance was somewhat dishevelled, and he appeared rather thin and emaciated, as if he hadn't eaten for a long while. He did have a propensity to drink a little too much, which was worrisome for my father, who claimed that before my uncle moved to England he had barely touched the stuff at all. "What has that dreadful woman done to my poor brother?" he confided to my mother. "I mean, the poor man is broken. He's a shadow of his former self. He's refusing to talk about the divorce. I can tell he's very aggrieved and distressed, the way he's tucking into that drink, as if it's cranberry juice. It bothers me greatly, it really does." "Well, drink is never the answer to your problems," reflected my mother. "It's emotionally healing to talk about your troubles. I also think a little light exercise would do him the world of good." My parents began to actively encourage my uncle to take regular walks around our property, and of course the surrounding rather remote rural area, which was indeed breathtakingly beautiful. "There's nothing more healing than a brisk walk in the countryside," my mother had assured him. "It will help you heal, Teddy, like nothing else I know. Nature is the best medicine for the soul." Before long, Teddy began to take my mother's advice, and he took regular walks in the countryside. Sometimes he was gone for hours on end, and every day he looked a little brighter, and the colour was coming back into his sunken cheeks. He would talk about the indigenous wildlife he encountered, and would enthuse about the ravishing countryside. We all could discern a remarkable change in his countenance. Once again he had resumed his shaving rituals, which had to be a good thing, and the ugly beard that covered his boyish face had disappeared. He was one of those men who just simply did not look good sporting a beard. Another promising sign was that he appeared to be paying much more attention to his appearance, and even my mother had noted a spring to his step. "You forget how big things are in America," he explained to her. "I just cannot get over the space here, and the areas of woodland are quite breathtaking. I think you're right, Tracy," he said, referring to my mother. "I'm already beginning to feel like a brand new man. I'm energized and more positive about my life." "Didn't I tell you?" laughed my mother. One day my uncle came bolting through the kitchen. He was hyperventilating and breathing heavily, and he grabbed a large bottle of brandy and began to glug it down his throat like lemonade. I remember his eyes were so wide and his mouth was hanging open. It was clear that he was deeply distressed, unsettled and discomposed by something. My mother tried to calm him down, but he was shaking like a leaf and seemed incredibly rattled. "Has something happened?" asked my mother. "You look as white as a sheet. Have you had a scare of some kind?" "I've seen a black monster in the woods, an ape-man. It attacked and killed a poacher, and I saw it with my eyes." My uncle began to sob uncontrollably. "I thought it was going to kill me. It was big and hairy." My mother and father looked at each other, and it was clear that they did not entirely believe my uncle's account, and thought that all his emotional anxiety and upheaval around the divorce was making him hypersensitive. "Maybe you witnessed a bear attack," said my father. "I'll call the authorities immediately to let them know that someone's been mauled by a black bear. Unfortunately, this kind of thing does happen, and it's very frightening to observe. Thankfully, the creature didn't harm you, so we can be grateful for small mercies." The authorities were called, and the body was recovered, and it was all just put down to a bear attack. Years later, my uncle told me the true story about what had transpired that day, once I realised that he had indeed seen an ape-like humanoid, a creature that we liked to call Bigfoot. So this was his account in his own words. I was beginning to feel so much brighter, happier and more positive about my life, as moving in with my brother and his family into his delightful North Carolina farmhouse was quintessential the wisest decision I've ever made, as it helped me get back on my feet again and rebuild my shattered and broken life. I'm not going to kid you, there were harrowing, grievous moments when I simply wanted to just swallow a whole bunch of pills and be done with it all. At that point in time, I began to feel helplessly lost and despairing, as if the world was closing in on me and had become a dark, oppressive place of which there was no light at the end of the tunnel, nor was there any hope on the horizon for me. For me personally, getting a divorce was one of the hardest blows of my entire life. And despite everything, I still loved my ex-wife. Losing her was as bad as experiencing a death in the family. Granted, our relationship had been tumultuous at the best of times, and we had fought a great deal, over the silliest, most pathetic things, I might add. Yet, despite all the hiccups along the way, I still believed our relationship was worth saving. When my wife began having an affair with another woman, it was the cruelest, most underhanded blow of all, as I knew that I could never ever compete. When my wife informed me that she had secretly hankered after other women all her life, ascertaining that she had been a closet lesbian all along, I must confess that was paradoxical and incomprehensible for me to fathom. I had never guessed, even for a single moment, that she actually had leanings towards the other side. Finally, we both agreed that getting divorced was the only solution, especially considering my wife confessed that she had fallen head over heels in love with another woman. This woman looked like the female version of Arnold Schwarzenegger, without being unkind. She had a shaven head, tattoos and biceps on her arm that would make mine look puny by contrast. It was then that I decided that I needed to get out of England and return to America, as that would create a larger enough distance between the two of us to begin our new lives. I couldn't face the prospect of bumping into my wife arm in arm in the street with another woman, who looked like she'd stepped out of a female prison and beaten up all the inmates. I'm not exaggerating, as that was how rough her new partner actually looked, which made me wonder why she'd ever found me attractive. I've always been incredibly close to my brother, and so staying with him on his farm was a tremendous blessing for me. I really don't think I would have held it together without the support of his loving family. Tracy, his wife, was right that venturing out into the wide open spaces was healing for me, until one day everything changed. After eating a hearty breakfast of bacon and eggs, washed down with some hot mugs of tea, I decided to set out for another brisk walk, armed with my pair of binoculars and a bottle of drinking water. I remember it was a blissfully pleasant day, with some warm sunshine and a gentle breeze blowing against my face. I trekked along several windy dirt roads, kicking up some of the pebbles with my boots. Finally, I was turning into my favourite area of wood green. It was magical, like a fairy tale-like setting, enabling me to leave behind negative, irksome thoughts from my past and focus on the present and the future. In truth, I had no comprehension whatsoever that a wooded area like this could be so bedazzling, tranquil and calming. It was like the quintessential resplendent oasis of natural beauty, consisting of mature, very regal, statuesque-looking spruce, pine, cedar, oak and redwood trees, all with the most marvellous, shapely, sometimes even voluptuous trunks that rose up into the heavens like towering skyscrapers of nature. If that wasn't mesmerising enough, the shafts of sunlight that twinkled through the trees and dappled the forest floor in different shades of luminescent light were almost ethereal in their subtlety and soft radiance. I noticed that layers of velvety moss swathed the tree trunks and boulders with a rich, luxurious, verdant carpet, and shapely golden-brown umbrella funguses attached themselves to the lower trunks of the trees, while the forest floor was layered with sweet woodruff, large open lacy ferns, and interesting flowering ground covers. Most beguiling of all, however, was the stream that zigzagged through the woods with an energizing swift current, and the sound of the water crashing against the rocks was so soothing to my troubled soul. On most occasions, as I'd ambled through the sublime wooded retreat, I'd been serenaded by the sounds of pretty birdsong, or I would catch a brief sighting of a few startled deer darting out of my sight as quickly as they could, or a squirrel eyeing me curiously with its brown, bright, sparkling eyes. On this occasion, everything was airily quiet, so much so, in fact, that I could feel chills going down my spine, and my hair was standing on edge. I really got the sense that I wasn't alone, and I could feel that I was being watched, but I looked around and saw absolutely nothing. I also detected a rather strange smell in the air, which wasn't something I was well acquainted with. It did smell rather sweaty and skunky. That was when I heard a man's voice, or men's voices, should I say, laughing, and I could hear their rifles firing at random, sounding like kids playing with BB guns. I realised that someone was hunting illegally, as there had been warning signs saying hunting prohibited everywhere. I realised that these were poachers, and I didn't want to stick around to get accidentally shot. Before I had a chance to make my hurried escape, a rough-looking thuggish man emerged through the thicket and walked directly towards me. He stopped dead in his tracks for a moment. I knew I'd caught him off guard, and he hadn't expected to see me. I noted a deep scowl developing on his face, and his cold, hard brown eyes glared at me very coldly. "Who are you?" he asked defensively. "I'm just taking a walk in the wood green, but I'm leaving now," I assured him. The insidious, shady-looking character immediately made me feel ill at ease and unsettled. I was greatly disturbed when he kept pointing his rifle in my direction, almost like he was guilefully trying to warn me off. "Good idea," scoffed the man. "You wouldn't want to end up accidentally shot, would you? Or easy meal for the coyotes?" He began to laugh, as if he seemed to find his sense of humour highly amusing, but I most certainly did not. I sensed an underlying undercurrent of artful threat to his words. If you had told me he'd buried a body in the woods, I would have believed you. There was something very devious and shifty about him that made my skin crawl. "Who is this?" came the husky deep voice of another man, who emerged through the thicket, regarding me with very suspicious hard eyes that were seemingly devoid of any kindness. He was even more intimidating and thuggish than the first man that I had encountered, as he was looking like a menacious gangster, covered in inky blue tattoos of giant octopuses and dragons, and on his bald head there was a skull and crossbones, making him appear much more than a little menacing and pugnacious. And if that wasn't enough, his rifle was almost pointed directly in my face, causing me to tremble. Were they intent on killing me, I wondered in horror? I wouldn't have put anything past them. "What are you doing here?" he demanded in a threatening tone. "I'm just taking a walk," I said. "Well, you need to get out of here," said the man. "We're hunting, and you need to watch your back. And if you dare tell anyone that you saw us here, you'll be sorry. Do you understand?" He said this while reenacting a chicken having its head ripped off with his hands. I knew exactly what he was saying. "I've got enough problems of my own to contend with," I said. "It's none of my business what you get up to in here." "Don't be hard on him," said a small man emerging through the brush in a plaid shirt and jeans. "I'm sure he's telling you the truth. Don't hurt him. Leave him alone. If you hurt him like you did the other man, I shan't be keeping my mouth shut. Not this time." "Shut up, Johnny. The day I need your advice, I'll ask you for it. The man's going. He's not going to give us any trouble, are you?" "No," I said. "No, I'm not." Johnny suddenly became very distracted. "I think we should call it a day," he said, looking alarmed. "Something's not right about the woods today. I feel it in my gut." "Johnny, for goodness sake, get a grip," said the man with the bald head. "We're here to hunt. Stop being such a mama's boy." "I'm not," Johnny protested. "Something is watching us. I can feel it, and it's creeping me out." All of a sudden we heard a loud growl. It was so discomposing that all four of us just stood, very still, hardly daring to move a muscle. The only way I can describe the sound to you was that it was deeper and more menacing than that of a lion. "What the heck?" said the bald man. "What was that?" Then I noted that the saplings began to sway backwards and forwards, and I could see the silhouette or dark outline of a large form. And then it peered in at us through the branches, pulling them away like a curtain, from 8 feet off the ground. And it possessed a dome-shaped head, and I can only describe that it looked like a humanoid ape. I was so startled and spooked by what I was seeing that I began to question my own sanity, for indeed I'd never seen a critter looking like this before. It was the most terrifying thing that I've ever seen in my entire life, and even a lion seemed like a pussycat compared to this monstrous, colossal, and very intimidating beast. I remember feeling my stomach twisting into hundreds of knots, and my heart fluttering so fast, so much so that I could hear every single beat reverberating in my chest really loudly. I knew beyond a shadow of a doubt that we were in the presence of an apex predator. Kill him, shouted the man with the bald head. "Kill him now." 2 of the men began to shoot at the critter, but Johnny just stood there, frozen to the spot, seemingly unable to move a muscle. I realised that, just like myself, he was also incapacitated by fear, and overwhelmed by the horror of this surreal situation. The indignant, livid critter came charging through the brush like a rampaging elephant. He was incandescent with rage. He thundered aggressively towards the bald man, grabbing him violently by the shoulders and tearing the rifle out of the man's hand. I watched in absolute horror as he snapped this man's rifle in half, as if it was just a kid's toy, and threw it into the brush. I will never forget the absolute dread and sheer horror in the bald man's blue eyes. He'd been so cocky when he had approached me with such an aggressive manner, but he now looked like a petrified little boy, as his eyes grew round with alarm. I watched in amazement as he began to sprint away, all the while screaming, "No! No! No! Please, no!" In his attempts to run, he tripped a couple of times, but he was no match for this critter. Never in all my born days have I ever seen anything move as fast as this critter did. In a second he grabbed the bald man. He lifted him up by the scruff of his collar until he was staring directly into the man's eyes, with a very mean look on his face. For a moment the eyes of the bald man locked into the eyes of this beast. The critter then rolled back his lips, exposing his human-like teeth, and began to growl again incredibly fiercely. And I promise you that even the ground vibrated as he growled. All of a sudden, he tossed the man about 20 feet up into the air, where he came crashing down, landing on his head, which burst open like a chicken egg, and all the brain matter came oozing out onto the ground. I noted that the man who had initially approached me in the wood green had surreptitiously made his escape, leaving the two of us stranded, yards away from this ferocious, capricious and volatile predator. I was absolutely certain I was already dead, and I began to pray desperately as I saw my life flashing before my very eyes. Once the critter had killed the man, he went over to the dead body and kicked it several more times, and then he seemed to calm down. "Please don't hurt us," I cried out. "We weren't the ones shooting at you. We weren't going to hurt you." Johnny followed my lead. "No, we weren't going to hurt you. Please, please don't kill us," he begged. Whether the critter understood us or not, I have no idea, but there was a very evident humanness to his countenance that we appealed to. He stood still for a moment, studying us curiously through his deep-set dark eyes that seemed to no longer appear enraged. For a moment it was like he was looking straight through us, as if he could read our very thoughts. The critter suddenly seemed to become very relaxed and calm. It was like his aggression fully subsided. We were observing a completely different animal. To my amazement, he began to scratch and itch his back, and then in a nonchalant way he just strolled back into the wood green and glided away. Johnny and I remained frozen to the spot and did not move from our position for a long while. Even though I didn't know Johnny personally, we locked into a warm embrace as we realized we were so lucky to be alive, and that the critter had no intention of harming us. We couldn't believe it. Johnny looked at me and exclaimed, "I cannot believe Dirk is dead, but he had it coming to him. I mean, anyone could see you don't shoot at something like that. He was asking for trouble. He always is. I warned them that the woods didn't feel right today, but they wouldn't listen." He then turned around to me and said, "Do you mind telling the police that you saw a dead man in the woods? I don't want to get involved with any of this, as I've already been arrested for poaching before. I don't need any more trouble on my back." I nodded and then walked away, hardly daring to believe what had just happened. I knew the only reason Johnny and I had escaped with our lives is that we hadn't actually challenged the critter with a rifle. It would seem that the critter had not suffered any wounds from the barrage of bullets he had faced, which in itself was incredulous. I walked back to my brother's farmhouse, pondering on what it was I had seen. The critter must have been about 8 foot tall, 4 feet across on the shoulder area. He had short, stocky legs and very long arms, and was built as solidly as an army tank, and easily weighed about 800 pounds. I noted he was covered in long human-like hair that was dark brown in colour, but with a very distinct auburn hue in certain lights. The face was human-like, with a nut-brown skin that was the texture of leather. I noted that the critter had a head shaped rather like a dome that seamlessly folded into his shoulders, with no apparent neck to speak of. What I remember was those eyes, and how they changed from hateful to gentle in just such a short period of time. When I returned to my brother's farmhouse, it was like the post-traumatic stress of the event reoccurred and replayed in my mind. I began to have the most horrifying flashbacks of the bald man's death. Even though he was an awful man, I wouldn't have wished his death on anyone. When I told my brother and his wife what I'd actually seen, I knew that they thought I'd seen a bear. But I know what I saw, and this was no bear. But I also perceived that unless they'd actually seen it themselves, how could they ever believe my story? I certainly wouldn't in their shoes. So there you are. That was my uncle's story, which even as a young boy, I failed to believe at the time. Yet it's amazing how things change, because in the twinkling of an eye, when I was walking through the wood green myself one day, I had an encounter with the beast that my uncle had described so eloquently. Possibly not the same one, but a critter fitting a similar description. Nevertheless, I'm very glad to inform you that the critter I encountered was benign. It was more afraid of me than I was of it. I encountered it quite by chance. It was eating the grubs from the inside of a tree branch, and it suddenly looked up and on seeing me glided away so fast, taking 5-foot strides and vanishing from my sight. For days afterwards, I kept asking myself, did I really see that? Surely not. But I knew what I saw. I'm glad to tell you that my uncle did actually remarry and is now happily living relatively close to us in North Carolina, and I used to visit him regularly over the years, and we became incredibly close. All these years later, after the coverage on the Sasquatch, we knew what we saw were clearly Bigfoot. So there you are. That's my story, and my uncle's as well.
Dear Sarah and all your lovely listeners, my name is Casey, and I'm from the northwestern states in the United States known as Idaho, which is well known for its mountainous landscape and vast swathes of wilderness and outdoor areas for recreational activities like hiking, mountain biking and horse riding. Our capital, Boise, is situated at the foothill of the Rocky Mountains and is intersected by the Boise River, well known for rafting and fishing. I live in southwestern Idaho in a lush park-like property with ubiquitous trees that make up a vast sylvan towards the rear of my land. I live along the Payette River that drains into the Snake River to give you an idea of bearings. Our house is the quintessential beautiful wooden log home, built in a more modern contemporary style, but inspired by early, former historic, rather nostalgic, wistful log homes from our past that stir up evocative, sentimental memories of bygone days, with hunters returning home from the hunt, with hungry stomachs being greeted by their adoring kids and welcomed home by a devoted wife offering him a huge hearty bowl of beef stew, which he eats by a crackling fire with his whole family. I'm very partial towards our sumptuous cosy abode because it's so large and spacious with large open fireplaces and seamless large glass windows overlooking exquisite lakefront views that still have the ability to take my breath away, despite the fact that I've lived in this spectacular part of the world for many years with my wife Pamela and our 2 young boys, Curtis and Jonathan, who were about 10 years old at the time of my story, which occurred in the spring of 2005. My incredulous story begins when I decided to buy 2 beautiful dogs, as my children had been begging me to get them a furry friend. But I'm a huge procrastinator that tends to take my time pondering and ruminating over every single decision I make. I was desirous to get the very best dog to suit our family needs, and was thinking about purchasing 2 Bernese mountain dogs, but I kept wavering over my decision. Was it the right breed for our family, I wondered? I could not be sure. My mother, who lived in Dallas, informed me that I was far better off getting a couple of Beacon Fries, and when I wrote down bacon fries. Oh, they're the most adorable dogs, she told me. You really don't want to get something big and rambunctious that could potentially knock the children over. I think smaller dogs are so much better, and this is a very good breed for you. Of course, the 2 women in my life did not agree. My wife believed emphatically that for a sizable property like ours, we needed larger dogs, and she gets very frustrated by me when I become indecisive. For goodness sake, Casey, she snapped, stop dilly-dallying and buy those 2 dogs for the family.
But, I protested, no buts, Casey. I'm tired of those buts of yours. Just get those dogs now, she ordered. And that was that. You may think my wife is a bully, but that is certainly not the case, as she's actually rather a saint, putting up with my ambiguous temperament. Not to put too fine a point on it, of course, I am the kind of husband that would drive most women nuts, because I'm so ambivalent, and can never make my mind up about anything. I've been informed that this is because I'm a Libran star sign, and even I get frustrated with my own unassertive and irresolute approaches to life. I'm glad that my job in the paper industry does not require any decision-making, or I really would be in hot water. And so it was, after my wife's prompting, I returned home with 2 adorable balls of fluff that originate from the Swiss Alps and have roots with Roman Mastiffs. They're supposed to be intelligent, loyal, and very affectionate, which I was to discover is indeed the case. When the dogs were old enough, I built them a very sizable outside wooden house, far bigger than a natural kennel. It was the size of a standard bedroom, both in height and width, and I put an old couch in there, a large bed, dog beds, and even toys for them to play with, so they really had their own little doggy oasis, so to speak, that protected them from the outside elements. I wanted them to have their own indoor space, where no one would mind if they tore the beds to shreds, if you know what I mean. Before long, our family became very attached and devoted to the 2 long-haired dogs that we named Pegasus and Gypsy, and my children adored the black and white tan bundles of fur that they played with every day, throwing around balls and frisbees and fondling their lovely long coats. It was not long before I began to notice some strange irregularities in regards to the outside doghouse. One thing I observed was that when I went into the doghouse in the early mornings to fill up the water bowls and to feed my dogs, I would detect a very strange odour in the room. Don't get me wrong, it was by no means offensive. It was just very different, and I knew the pungent smell did not come from my dogs. The only way I could describe the smell, that it rather reminded me of fermented apples, not to put too fine a point on it. I noticed the smell was strongest on the large bed in the corner of the room. That was decidedly odd. It gave me the very distinct impression that something or someone had been lying on that bed for quite a considerable period of time in order for the scent to be that pronounced. Then if that wasn't strange enough, the bowls of dog biscuits I'd given my dogs remained untouched, day in and day out. As you can imagine, I became increasingly concerned for the health of my animals, as I couldn't fathom why they were not eating their food, but to look at, they were bouncy balls of ubiquitous energy, which didn't make any sense at all, considering they didn't appear to be eating. After a solicitor's visit to the vet, I was assured and consolidated by the check-up that both my dogs were indeed fighting fit and putting on plenty of healthy weight required for growing puppies. The vet went as far as to say that both my dogs were in pristine, excellent condition, and even asked what my secret was and what I was actually feeding them, because of their glossy coats. He described them as among the healthiest dogs he'd ever met. I remember feeling exceedingly perturbed and bemused, as my dogs were eating absolutely nothing. Well, that's what I thought at the time. I was later to discover leg bones of deer and other animals lying strewn over the floor, and I began to realise that someone else was feeding my dogs behind my back. And if they were getting fresh meat delivered to them daily, it was hardly a wonder they weren't interested in their measly dog biscuits, and who could blame them for that? I mean, if I was a dog, I'd sooner have a fillet steak any day than a bland biscuit diet, wouldn't you? Other strange things happened at night, as during the night I'd hear whistling and the sound of our dogs making those happy, jubilant barks, so indicative of the sounds they made when they were pleased to see us after we returned home from a shopping stint. This was when I began to suspect that our dogs were being visited by a stranger, and I remember feeling rather angry about this, because these dogs were ours, for goodness sake. What right did a transient have to interact with our animals, not to mention bringing them choice meat all the time? It just wasn't right, and that was outright bribery, because if the dogs kept receiving 5-star treatment like this from the mysterious interloper, it would naturally predispose them to liking this impostor more than any of us, which didn't bode well with me. My wife kept telling me to get a grip, and that our visitor, whoever they were, was probably a young lonely boy who just happened to love animals. I mean, what was the harm in that, she told me. I've no idea where my wife got this peculiar idea in her head from, but she was so insistent that we did not interfere with the strange anomalies around our home, and told me over and over again, in no uncertain terms, to stop overreacting. One night I heard a shrill whistling sound very clearly, as it was very high-pitched. I sat up very suddenly in my bed, aroused from my deep sleep, wondering whether I had dreamt the sound. But then I heard it again, and I was certain of it. I stumbled out of bed cloddishly and made my way towards the bedroom window, which was on the second floor of our home. It was a particularly dark night, and glancing down towards our verdant lawn, all I could see was the large silhouette of this man, who looked to be about 8 foot tall and 3 foot wide. I mean, how was that even possible? I mean, even the tallest humans aren't that big. So I was flummoxed and confused. That really is an understatement when I say that. It was difficult to discern this individual closely because it was too dark outside, with not enough sufficient moonlight to pronounce his features clearly. It was what my dogs were doing that really was discomposing for me. They were acting as if this stranger was indeed their very best friend, licking him all over his face and wagging their tails profusely. I noted that even my dogs are not that affectionate towards me, which left me feeling really rather annoyed and aggrieved at this stranger, who was playing with them and ruffling up their coats affectionately, and they were loving every minute of it. For me he appeared very hazy and blurred, like the vague pictures of a television set on the blink, because the night was not kind to my field of vision. I began to shake my wife vigorously to try and arouse her, and at the best of times she's not very amenable to be awoken during the middle of the night, as she's always disagreeable and grumpy if you try and rouse her from a deep sleep. But on this occasion I was determined to get her undivided attention, but I need not have even bothered, given her nonchalant, disinterested response. "Get up," I said. "Get up quickly. I want to show you something. Get up now." "What's it now, Casey?" grumbled my wife, sounding annoyed. "Can't you get to sleep?" "The man, he's out there, playing with our dogs." "Oh, please, Casey," moaned my wife. "Leave the poor boy alone and let him play with our dogs if he wants to. What's the harm in that? He means them no harm." "But," I stammered, "the boy is 8 feet tall." "Oh, don't be ridiculous, Casey," moaned my wife. "Get back to sleep. Your imagination is playing tricks with you. Go back to bed, for goodness sake, and stop being so ridiculous." I must admit I stood there feeling exceedingly frustrated, especially with my wife, because no one was taking me seriously at all. But I knew I didn't want someone messing around with my dogs, and so I ventured outside armed with my rifle. That was when I heard the sound of someone bolting out of the doghouse as fast as they could. I knew that the fellow had heard me, based on the startled noise he made, that rather reminded me of paint cans being tossed around violently. I was to find out later that he'd actually knocked over the dog bowls in his hurry to escape. It was that raucous, banging and crashing, very loud sound, as quite honestly the dude sounded like a rhino charging through the thicket as he ran away. I was able to observe his ghostly shadow gliding away as fast as he could, glancing nervously back in my direction. What alarmed me the most was that this evasive person moved like the wind, taking 5-foot strides into the sylvan, and then he was gone. It would seem that not only was he the fastest man that I've ever observed in my life, but the tallest too. I went back into the doghouse to see 2 very exuberant dogs that were very excited to see me, if not rather surprised and bewildered, given how late it was. I noted the room smelt very pungent with apple cider, and now I was certain the stranger was also a drunkard, who rather enjoyed a little too much cider, and clearly loved dogs. It wasn't a good mix as far as I was concerned. I could see my dogs were still enjoying some meaty bones that they'd been given, and their dog biscuits had barely been touched, but given the thick layers of meat dangling off the bone, I did understand their preferences. The next morning I happened to notice some distinct footprints outside the doghouse that left me completely speechless. It transpired that for an entire week our whole area had been hit with turbulent weather, with constant thunderstorms and incessant unrelenting rain, relegating our entire family to indoor activities like card games and chess, as conditions outdoors were less than favourable, and the yard had literally become like a mud bath, and the turf exceedingly wet. Imagine my total amazement when I observed a gigantic footprint in the ground. I measured it with my tape measure and it was over 20 inches long. I mean, who in the world has feet that large? Even when I placed my foot in the print, it was seemingly swallowed up by the sheer size of this thing, and I don't exactly have small feet. I immediately called my wife to come outside, and I could see her rolling her eyes in the back of her head as she came out into the backyard to humour me, waggling her wooden spoon in her hands, as she was in the middle of making a cheese sauce for the mac and cheese we were having later that evening. "What's it now, Casey?" she groaned. "This better be good," she exclaimed. "I do not appreciate being dragged out in the middle of my cooking. The last thing I need is my cheese sauce to get lumpy." "Look," I exclaimed. "That 8-foot man that I keep telling you about, that is surreptitiously visiting our dogs and sneaking them food. Look at his footprint. It's 20 inches long. That's insane. It's not normal. It practically swallows my own shoe size. And my feet are pretty big, let me tell you." "Oh, for goodness sake, Casey, have you really got nothing better to do with your time than obsess about people's shoe sizes? But look at the size of this thing, sweetheart. It's massive. I measured it. It's 20 inches. "Casey, some people do actually have big feet," said my wife, barely even glancing at the footprints. "I once had a girlfriend at school who had shoes especially made for her because her feet were so enormous. I think she was a size 11 or 12. It does happen, dear." I could see her shaking her head as she returned to the kitchen. I could tell she was not taking anything seriously at all and was thinking I was just a silly man with a bee in my bonnet about something. For many weeks this erroneous behaviour with the tall man seemed to continue, and of course no one in my family paid any attention to the strange goings-on, nor did they care about my grave concerns regarding this curious matter. Even my children were indifferent, and they became accustomed to the peculiar smells of apple cider in the dog room, including all the bones, and none of them batted an eyelid. I also realised with horror that I was actually the butt of everybody's jokes, as I once eavesdropped in on my wife's conversation with her girlfriends and heard her telling them over tea in our living room that I claimed that a giant 8-foot drunk with huge feet was visiting our dogs in the middle of the night with fresh meat deliveries. For some reason everybody found that highly amusing, and I'm sure people thought I was smoking something, but I knew what I'd seen. I remember her friends giving me these fleeting, pitiful looks, as if in some way I wasn't quite right in the head. One day we discovered to our horror that Gypsy had disappeared and had seemingly vanished into thin air. We sent out leaflets, put posters up on trees in our area, and contacted local shelters to spread the word that Gypsy was missing, but no one had seen either sight or sound of her. My children were naturally very upset, and Pegasus became lonely because he was all on his own without a friend, so my wife immediately went and brought another Burmese mountain dog behind my back, possibly because she knew I would take forever to decide whether such a move was a good idea or not. We chose to call the male dog Captain, and he became a welcomed, very treasured addition to our family, with a very congenial temperament, I might add. I felt very disgruntled with my wife as I told her that the 8-foot man had stolen Gypsy. This was confirmed to me when the doghouse no longer smelt of apple cider, and there were no fresh meat deliveries for Pegasus, and he had reluctantly begun to eat his doggy biscuits, which had to be a good thing, surely. One day I decided to go and explore the sylvan at the back of my property that stretched back for many miles and was a substantial habitat for indigenous wildlife. It was an area that I never visited much because it was very overgrown, but on this occasion I decided to investigate it, as I knew that the strange man that had visited our property had run deep into the sylvan. Could it be that he hung around there, and was it possible that he had abducted Gypsy? For me, the idea seemed very plausible. As I walked through the shaded, enchanting treed oasis that consisted of ponderosa pines, red cedar, Douglas firs and hemlocks, I was amazed to find so many wide trails in this wooded area, as this sylvan was not maintained by anyone, but someone had been keeping the trails quite open, which was more than a little baffling, but very pleasing, of course. I'd like to point out that I had never discerned this before. In the past the thicket had been quite overgrown, but not now. I noticed that there were periwinkles and violets and ferns that carpeted the forest floor so prettily, and the morning sun filtered through the trees, dappling this wooded retreat in resplendent light, rather like an artist's palette, providing different tonal shades to all the scenery. I also observed rocky ridges and steep elevated mountain trails, and of course an enchanting silvery stream that meandered through the valley. I remember thinking to myself how magical this place was because it was incredibly beguiling, and the forest was alive with pretty bird song and warbles, and I noted little rabbits hopping around the woodland area, and I could also detect copious amounts of deer scat. Suddenly I could see my beautiful dog Gypsy running towards me as if we'd never been apart. She covered my face with wet licks and thumped her tail happily on the ground. I could feel the tears of joy welling up in my eyes. "Gypsy! Where did you get to? Where have you been? We've been looking for you everywhere, my girl. We've missed you so much." I cradled her joyfully in my arms, and I could see that she was in excellent, vibrant health, and seemed incredibly happy, and was also very delighted to see me. All of a sudden I could discern something or someone watching me from the tree line, and it caused the hairs on the back of my neck to stand up on end. I looked up towards the vertical line of the ponderosa pines, and there he was, and he was not even attempting to hide his presence from me, for indeed I think he wanted me to behold him. I was so shocked by what I was observing with my eyes that I was rather too overwhelmed and nonplussed to actually be afraid, although in hindsight I most certainly should have been, given the imposing colossal size of the critter. I knew at once that I was scrutinising the mysterious 8-foot elusive stranger whom had been paying regular visits to my doghouse. But this was no man. What was he? I couldn't even begin to imagine, for I'd never heard of such an outlandish critter existing in North America. For this encounter was so incredulous and bizarre, it literally shifted my perception of reality, rather like a bolt of lightning, making me re-examine everything I knew about the natural world. This humanoid critter was remarkably human in his countenance, but there were very evident ape-like influences to his appearance, most especially noted in the long flowing chocolate-brown hair that covered his entire body, with the exception of his broad heart-shaped face that was hairless, and was a deep nut-brown colour, rather like a Caucasian man who's browned considerably from extensive sun exposure. I noted that the overlong arms hung well beyond his knees, and he possessed a very distinctive pyramid-shaped head with a point at the top, and this head flowed into the shoulders seamlessly, and there was no evidence of a neck. I also could not comprehend the astounding size of this critter, as in close proximity I noted how colossal he actually was, and I think he would have impressed the bodybuilding community, as his muscle strength and definition were off the charts. I think he was easily about 800 pounds, but I cannot be too sure on these details. What I do know, however, is that the humanness to this critter was quite profound. I would not describe myself as an accomplished hunter by any manner of means, but I think I would have found it a challenge to take a pop shop at one of these beings, because they have an uncanny humanness which would cause me to wrestle with my conscience over such a manoeuvre. The critter stood there regarding me with his deep-set dark eyes, but he didn't appear hostile or even remotely aggressive. It was like he was observing me in a mellow, carefree fashion from a distance, with a keen, inquisitive interest and intrigue. This was not very consoling for me, however, because I was so intimidated by this beast, as I discerned I was in the presence of an apex predator, as indeed, if this critter wanted to kill me, he could have done so in a heartbeat, with the efficiency and skill of a human twisting a chicken's neck. It would have been that easy for him. I noted that my gypsy was looking towards the critter with such an adoring expression on his face and wagging his tail profusely, and he dashed towards the critter, barking happily and then returning back to me. "Come, girl," I said, grabbing her by the collar. "Come." Gypsy froze to the spot, resisting my determined efforts to take her back home. I tried to drag her, but she would not budge or move a muscle. She refused to go with me. I realised with absolute horror that Gypsy did not want to come home with me. Now that was very hard for me to accept. How was that even possible, as she was our family dog? To my amazement, the critter whistled and Gypsy ran eagerly towards him. I watched in absolute awe and disbelief as Gypsy embraced this hairy critter with an obedient devotion, like they were just so incredibly bonded. I've never seen anything like this before, as I could see how attached they were to each other, and it was quite moving to see the tenderness between the two of them, yet disconcerting at the same time. It was not easy for me to accept, as you can imagine. I watched in stupefied awe and in stunned silence as the two of them glided into the forest together. Gypsy had made her decision. She had chosen to live with this strange humanoid critter over me, and that was hard to fathom, as it made no sense to me at all, and was very discomposing. Of course, when I returned home to tell my wife what I'd seen, she asked me if I was feeling well. "Sweetheart," she said, "you must be coming down with something. You look rather peaky." "Did you hear what I said? Gypsy's in the wood living with the 8-foot hairy monster that I told you about." "I heard you, dear," said my wife. "I know you miss Gypsy terribly much. We all do. But we need to move on now, so stop feeding your imagination with these crazy, nonsensical ideas. It's not healthy for you. And even if what you say is true, and the boy did take Gypsy and wants her to stay with him, well, she's made her choice. She's chosen him over us." "But it's a big, hairy, ape-like monster that's taken her," I told my wife, knowing at once that I must sound so silly. No wonder she thought I was off my head. Imagine my amazement when a little while later my wife had actually called the doctor around to her house. "Oh, thank you, Dr. Murray, for coming. I'm rather worried about Casey. Ever since our dog Gypsy went missing, he's been a little out of sorts. He's been talking all kinds of nonsensical stuff about 8-foot monsters living in the Sylvan, kidnapping her. I think he's having hallucinations. He is predisposed to having a very overactive imagination at the best of times." "Oh, I see," said the doctor. "Now that is interesting. He's obviously traumatized by losing his dog. He may respond well to some counselling sessions, as he's not alone in his distress in losing an animal. It happens very, very often. It's a common phenomenon now, as people become very attached to their pets." "That's not a bad idea," said my wife, "but have you got anything to calm him down immediately?" So after being given a bunch of tranquilizers to calm my nerves, and advised by the doctor to procure some counselling sessions, I came to the realization that I needed to let sleeping dogs lie. One day, imagine my amazement when we discovered 6 healthy-looking baby puppies on our doorstep in an apple container, and they were the cutest puppies that I've ever seen. I remember my exuberant kids came running into the house telling me they'd found some baby mountain dogs on the step in the box, and our family fell in love with all these quintessential bundles of joy. And of course my kids wanted to keep them all, but let me assure you that was never going to happen. I realised at once the origins of these mysterious puppies. They were from the 8-foot hairy man in the woods, and that they were clearly Gypsy's puppies. But imagine my amazement when blood tests confirmed that they were pedigree Burmese mountain dogs. Then it hit me like a brick to the head that Gypsy had never been spayed, nor had Captain had the snip. As a family, we'd been extremely lackadaisical in getting them neutered and spayed, so I realised that Captain was indeed the father and Gypsy the mother of those gorgeous little puppies. I imagine Captain had run off into the Sylvan when he smelt that Gypsy was on heat. I believe the strange hairy creature brought us the puppies so that we could find them loving homes, which is what we invariably did, although we did keep one of the puppies that we chose to call Biscuit. After a while we did get regular visits from Gypsy, as I think the hairy man felt sorry for us, so he brought her over to our home to interact not only with our animals, but with our children as well, and of course with her puppies. And these visits continued over many years. I took these golden opportunities to get a friend of mine who was a vet to give Gypsy her annual shots and inoculations. She would stay with us for a few hours and then return to her home in the Sylvan when she heard the hairy man whistling for her to go back. I realised Gypsy lived up to her name, as she was a gypsy in a manner of speaking. It was only about a couple of years later that my wife actually had a sighting of the critter, and she was very excited and told me, "Casey, you'll never believe what I saw. It was about 8 foot and covered with long hair." I remember saying to her, "Really? It sounds like your imagination is playing tricks with you, dear." All these years later, I realised that the critter in the woods fits the profile perfectly of a Bigfoot. So there you are. That's my story. Oh my word, I love that story.
Well, hello there. I hope you enjoyed the Omnibus edition. We've got many more coming our way for you to listen to. Sending you love wherever you are in the world, in North America, Canada, Kenya, wherever you may be. I send you lots and lots of love. Thank you for listening to my Omnibus, and I really do hope you enjoyed it, because that's the whole idea about it, is to give you some interesting stories to listen to. So until next time, goodbye and good night.